Welcome. Let the noise and the hurry of your time begin to recede. Find a quiet space, a comfortable stillness, and allow your thoughts to drift, to soften, to travel back with us. We are not journeying to a place of grandeur, not to a throne room or a battlefield. Our destination is humbler and far more vital. We are traveling to a small, enclosed patch of earth, a place of mud and toil, of desperate hope and profound knowledge. Let us begin not with a king, but with a woman. And let us begin not with a crown, but with the soil. This is the story of the peasant woman's garden, the forgotten heart of the medieval world. It is a story of survival, written not in ink, but in the turning of the earth, in the unfurling of a leaf, and in the patient, unending labor of a woman's hands. For the vast majority of people who lived and died in the 1,000-year span of the Middle Ages, life was an intimate and often brutal struggle for sustenance. And for the woman at the bottom of this great, hierarchical pyramid, her small garden was the primary battlefield in that struggle. It was a world unto itself, a universe in miniature, and it was hers in a way that almost nothing else was. In the rigid, patriarchal structure of the feudal world, a woman's life was defined by a series of nested dependencies. She was subject to her father, then to her husband, and always to the lord of the manor. The great, rolling fields that stretched out from the village, the fields of wheat, barley, and rye, were the domain of men. Their labor there was communal, organized, and directed by the lord's reeve. It was public work, the great engine of the manorial economy. But the small patch of land beside the family's hovel, the toft or croft, was different. This was her space, her responsibility. The world of the great fields produced the lord's wealth and the coarse bread for the table. But it was the woman's garden, her pottage plot, that provided the vital, life-sustaining difference between a monotonous, near-starvation diet and one that could, with skill and luck, keep her family healthy. It was the source of flavor, of vitamins, of medicine, and of hope. It was not land. It was a lifeline. This garden was not a choice. It was a necessity. It was an essential component of the peasant family's small, fragile economy. The work performed there was not counted in the official record of manorial duties. Yet it was as crucial as any ploughing or reaping. It was a woman's domain, a sphere of influence and expertise that existed in parallel to the world of men. Here, she was not merely a helper or a subordinate. She was the planner, the laborer, the scientist, and the harvester. Her knowledge was its own form of literacy, a deep, practical wisdom passed from mother to daughter, a silent curriculum of survival written in the language of roots and leaves. To understand the medieval world in its entirety, we must step away from the grand narrative of kings and popes and kneel with this woman in the damp earth of her small, essential garden. The story of the garden's year begins not in sunshine, but in the lingering bone-deep chill of late winter. It begins in a world of grey and brown, a landscape still held in the tight, cold grip of the frost. For the peasant woman, this was a time of gnawing hunger and profound anxiety. The stores from the previous harvest were dwindling. The dried peas were becoming fewer in their sack. The last of the stored onions were beginning to sprout, and the salted meat, if there had been any, was long gone. The pottage pot still bubbled over the hearth, but its contents were thin, a meager gruel of grain and water, offering little warmth and less cheer. It was in this atmosphere of scarcity, this deep winter weariness, that the first stirrings of the new garden year would begin. The first act was one of intention, of hope pitched against the bleakness of the present. The woman would begin to watch the sky, to read the subtle shifts in the pale, watery light. She would feel the change in the wind, a slight softening of its biting edge. She would notice the days lengthening, minute by minute, a small but significant victory of light over darkness. These were the signs, the ancient, unspoken signals that the great, frozen sleep of the earth was nearing its end, and she knew she had to be ready. Her first journey was to the seed cache. This was no grand seed bank, but a collection of small, precious packets, carefully stored away from the damp and the mice that plagued the single-roomed hovel. The seeds were stored in small clay pots, in pouches of stitched linen, or perhaps in the hollowed-out gourds of the previous year. They were the most valuable things she possessed. Each seed was a tiny, sleeping promise, a potential plant, a future meal. They were the genetic memory of her garden, the direct descendants of the strongest, most productive plants from the year before. The act of saving seed was one of the most critical tasks of her year, a sacred duty to the future, performed in the autumn with the same solemnity as a prayer. Now, in the grey light of a winter afternoon, she would open these pouches and examine her treasure. She would run the small, hard peas through her fingers, feel the sharp edges of the mustard seeds, and smell the faint oniony scent of the leek seeds. This was her arsenal for the coming battle against hunger. Her tools were few and simple, a testament to the poverty of her existence. There was no gleaming steel. Her primary tool was the spade, often a crude instrument made of wood, its digging edge perhaps hardened by charring in the fire, or, if she was fortunate, tipped with a small, precious sheathing of iron. There might be a digging stick, a long, sharpened pole for making holes for seeds, and a simple, short-handled hoe or mattock for breaking up the stubborn clods of earth. Perhaps she had a sickle for cutting greens and a knife, her all-purpose tool for everything else. These were not implements of leisure. They were extensions of her own body, worn smooth with use, their wooden handles stained with the sweat and soil of countless seasons. As the first true thaw began, when the ground was no longer as hard as iron, but had softened into a thick, cold, unwelcoming mud, the real work would begin. She would go out into the grey morning, her breath pluming in the damp air, and she would face her patch of earth. The garden at this time of year was a bleak and sorry sight. It was a rectangle of bare, frozen mud, perhaps littered with the blackened skeletons of last year's cabbage stalks and the tough, withered remains of bean vines. Her first task was to clear this debris, to pull and rake it into a pile to be burned. The ash then returned to the soil to offer a small measure of nourishment. Then came the turning. This was the most physically demanding work of the entire year. The soil did not yield. It resisted. It was a heavy, wet, clay-like substance, and turning it was an act of raw physical struggle. She would drive the spade into the earth with the weight of her entire body, levering up great, heavy clods of sodden soil. Her back would ache, her shoulders would burn, and her hands, unprotected by gloves, would become raw and blistered in the cold, damp air. Day after day, she would work her way across the small plot, a slow, methodical, and exhausting process. She was waking the garden from its winter sleep, breaking its hard, sealed surface to allow the air and the weak spring sun to penetrate its depths. This was not just a physical act, it was a ritual. She was preparing the womb of the earth for the seeds she would soon entrust to it. As she worked, she would be amending the soil in the few ways available to her. She would spread the ashes from her hearth, a source of valuable potash. She would carry out the contents of the household's chamber pot, the night soil, and dig it into a corner of the garden to mellow, a potent but dangerous source of nitrogen. If the family kept a pig or a cow, she would beg or bargain for a share of the precious manure from the communal dung heap, carrying it to her garden in a woven basket on her back. Every scrap of organic matter, vegetable peelings, eggshells, and the bones from a rare meal was returned to the earth. She was a master of a closed-loop system, a practitioner of a kind of intuitive, desperate sustainability. Nothing could be wasted. Every fallen leaf, every bit of ash, and every drop of waste was a potential source of the fertility that would mean the difference between a meager harvest and a plentiful one. Finally, the soil would be ready. It would be broken, aerated, and fed. And on a day that felt right, a day chosen by the phase of the moon or the feel of the air, she would begin to plant. The first seeds to go into the cold ground were the hardiest, the most resilient, the plants that could withstand the treacherous, unpredictable weather of early spring. She would plant her peas and broad beans, pushing each individual seed into the damp earth. With her thumb, a small act of faith and hope, she would sow the seeds of the all-important leek, a plant that would form the backbone of her winter cooking. She might plant rows of hardy greens, like colewort, and pungent root vegetables, like the parsnip, which was known to become sweeter after a frost. Each planting was a risk. A sudden, late cold snap, a common occurrence in the medieval climate, could freeze the ground solid again, killing the germinating seeds before they had a chance to sprout. A week of heavy, relentless rain could rot them in the ground. The early spring was a period of intense vulnerability, a time when a month of backbreaking labor could be wiped out in a single night. The woman could only plant her seeds, offer a quiet prayer to whatever saint or spirit she held dear, and wait. As she returned to her hovel at the end of a long day of this cold, hard work, her body aching, her hands caked in mud, she carried with her not the certainty of a harvest, but the fragile, flickering hope of one. The garden was awake, but its life, and the life of her family, hung in the most delicate and precarious of balances. The transition from the cold, hopeful struggle of early spring to the vibrant, chaotic growth of late spring and early summer was a momentous one. It began with a miracle that, no matter how many times the woman witnessed it, never lost its power to inspire a profound sense of wonder and relief. It was the sight of the first green shoots pushing their way up through the dark soil. After weeks of staring at a barren patch of brown earth, the appearance of those first, tender, almost impossibly vibrant green lines of seedlings was a confirmation that the cycle had begun again. Life had returned. The seeds had not rotted. The frost had not killed them. Her labor had not been in vain. But this initial moment of relief was immediately replaced by a new and even more demanding phase of work. The sun grew stronger, the days longer, and the rains of spring, combined with the growing warmth, triggered an explosion of life in her garden. It was a green tide, a powerful, relentless surge of growth, and it was her job to manage this tide, to channel it, to nurture the plants she wanted, and to wage a constant, unending war against those she did not. The most immediate and repetitive task of this season was weeding. The same conditions that encouraged her precious peas and leeks to grow also encouraged a veritable army of opportunistic weeds. Thistles with their sharp, spiny leaves, stubborn dandelions with their deep taproots, creeping buttercup, and a host of other unwanted plants would erupt from the soil, threatening to overwhelm her crops. These weeds were her direct competitors. They competed for sunlight, for water, and for the scarce nutrients in the soil. If left unchecked, they would quickly choke the life out of her carefully tended vegetables, resulting in a stunted and meager harvest. Weeding was a backbreaking, monotonous, and seemingly endless task. Day after day, in the gentle warmth of the morning or the long twilight of the evening, she would be in her garden, on her hands and knees, her fingers working their way through the soil. She would pull each weed by hand, taking care to get the entire root, a skill that required a practiced touch. A root left in the ground would simply sprout again. She used her simple hoe to scrape away the carpets of smaller weeds that grew between the rows. There were no herbicides, no shortcuts. There was only her own body, her patience, and her persistence. Her posture during these months was a constant, prayer-like stoop, her gaze fixed upon the ground, her world reduced to the intimate struggle between the desired plant and the invading weed. As her own seedlings grew, she was forced to perform another act of seeming cruelty. She had to thin her crops. She had planted her seeds thickly, a sensible insurance against poor germination. But now, where 3 or 4 healthy seedlings grew in a space that could only support one, she had to make a choice. She had to select the strongest, most promising seedling and ruthlessly pull out its neighbors. To a modern mind, this might seem wasteful, but she knew it was a vital necessity. Overcrowded plants would compete with each other, and all of them would grow up to be weak, spindly, and unproductive. By sacrificing the many, she ensured the strength and success of the few. This was the harsh but essential calculus of the garden. The tiny seedlings she pulled up were not wasted. They became the first fresh, green additions to the pottage pot in months, a welcome taste of the coming abundance. This was also the time when she planted the more tender crops, the ones that could not have withstood the frosts of early spring. She would plant her cabbages, her lettuces, and the great variety of pottage herbs that would form the bulk of her summer cooking. She would sow more successions of fast-growing crops like radishes, ensuring a continuous supply. Her garden was not a place of monoculture. It was a complex, layered, and intensely managed ecosystem, a polyculture designed for maximum productivity in a small space. She might practice a form of companion planting, a knowledge born of generations of observation, knowing that the pungent smell of onions and garlic seemed to deter the pests that plagued her cabbages. She knew that the tall beanstalks could provide a living trellis for other climbing plants. Her garden was a dense, interwoven tapestry of life, and she was its master weaver. The single most critical element during this period of explosive growth was water. While the spring rains were often plentiful, there could be long, dry spells, and a week without rain in the heat of early summer could be disastrous for the young, thirsty plants. The peasant woman had no access to a hose or a sprinkler system. Her only source of water was the village well, the river, or a nearby stream. And so, during these dry spells, another arduous task was added to her daily routine: the carrying of water. She would walk to the water source with 2 wooden buckets, perhaps carried on a wooden yoke across her shoulders to distribute the immense weight. The journey itself could be long. She would wait her turn at the crowded well, then lower the bucket into the darkness and haul it up, hand over hand, its weight a dead, pulling force. The journey back was a slow, careful balancing act, the heavy bucket sloshing with every step, her shoulders and back screaming in protest. She would then carefully dispense this precious water, not by broadcasting it wildly, but by pouring it directly at the base of each plant, ensuring that not a drop was wasted. On a hot day, her garden might require several such trips. The fetching of water was a ritual of endurance, a physical testament to the immense value of this simple, life-giving liquid. Her own sweat, mingling with the water she carried, was a double offering to the thirsty earth. As the season progressed, the garden transformed from a series of neat, vulnerable rows into a lush, chaotic, and vibrant jungle. The beanstalks would climb up their rough poles, their leaves forming a dense canopy. The cabbages would begin to form their tight, heavy heads. The onions and leeks would swell, their green tops a forest in miniature. The air in the garden would become thick with the smell of damp earth, crushed herbs, and the sweet scent of bean blossoms. It would be alive with the hum of bees and the flutter of butterflies, a small, vibrant oasis of life. For the woman, this was a time of cautious optimism. The threat of frost was gone. The plants were established. The pottage pot was now filled with fresh greens, tender roots, and the first young beans. The diet of her family was transformed, infused with the fresh, vital tastes of summer. After the long, hungry winter, this was a time of relative plenty, but she knew better than to be complacent. The green tide had brought life and abundance, but it had also brought new dangers. The greatest challenges of the garden year were yet to come, lurking in the full, heavy heat of high summer. High summer was the garden's moment of glorious, mature fulfillment. It was the zenith of the growing year, a time when the woman's small patch of earth was a riot of life, a dense, verdant tapestry of leaves, vines, and swelling vegetables. The beans hung in heavy clusters from their poles. The heads of her cabbages were tight and solid, and the pungent aroma of onions, garlic, and herbs filled the warm, still air. To an outside observer, it was a picture of rustic success, a testament to a season of hard work. But for the woman who tended it, this period of peak abundance was also the period of peak anxiety. The garden, now at its most productive, was also at its most vulnerable. The very forces that had encouraged its growth now threatened to destroy it. The sun, which had been a welcome, life-giving friend in the spring, now often became a tyrant. The medieval period experienced significant climatic fluctuations, and a summer drought was a recurring and terrifying threat. A week, then 2, then 3 might pass without a single drop of rain. The sky would be a pale, hazy, unforgiving blue. The earth in the garden would bake and crack, turning from a rich, dark brown to a pale, dusty grey. The leaves of the bean plants would curl and yellow at the edges. The cabbages would wilt in the afternoon heat, their broad leaves drooping sadly. During these times, the woman's already arduous task of carrying water became a desperate, all-consuming battle against dehydration. Her trips to the well would increase, her body pushed to the limits of its endurance. Every bucket of water seemed to vanish into the thirsty ground, a temporary reprieve but not a solution. She would try to conserve moisture in any way she could, perhaps by spreading a mulch of straw or dried weeds around the base of her plants to slow evaporation. But these were small measures against a relentless, baking heat. She would watch the sky, her heart aching with a desperate plea for clouds, for the smell of rain in the air. A prolonged drought meant more than just a smaller harvest. It could mean a total crop failure, the death of her entire garden, and a winter of unimaginable hunger. The relentless, beautiful, sunlit days of high summer could be, for her, a time of profound and terrifying dread. Even if the rain did come, it brought its own dangers. A summer thunderstorm, arriving with sudden, violent fury, could be just as destructive as a drought. The heavy, lashing rain could batter her plants, tearing leaves and breaking stems. A hailstorm, a particularly feared event, could shred her cabbages to ribbons and knock the beans from their vines in a matter of minutes, wiping out a season's work in a terrifying display of celestial violence. There was no protection, no shelter. She could only watch from the doorway of her hovel as the storm raged, her heart in her throat, praying that something of her garden would survive the onslaught. And then there were the pests, The warm, abundant life of the summer garden was an open invitation to a host of other creatures who saw her carefully tended vegetables as their own personal feast. The battle against pests was a relentless, hand-to-hand combat, a daily war of attrition. The greatest enemies of her brassicas, the cabbages and coleworts, were the caterpillars. The common white butterfly, a creature of innocent beauty to our eyes, was to her a harbinger of destruction. She would watch them fluttering over her garden with a sense of foreboding, knowing that each one was laying dozens of tiny eggs on the undersides of her cabbage leaves. A few days later, these eggs would hatch into a silent, chewing army of small green caterpillars. Their appetite was voracious. They would chew small holes, then larger ones, and could reduce a healthy cabbage head to a skeletonized, slimy ruin in an astonishingly short period of time. Her only defense was her own vigilance and her own hands. She would spend hours turning over each leaf, her eyes scanning for the tiny green eggs, which she would crush between her thumb and forefinger. She would pick off each caterpillar, one by one, dropping them into a pot to be destroyed or fed to the chickens. It was a disgusting, tedious, and never-ending task. No matter how many she picked off one day, there always seemed to be more the next. Slugs and snails were another insidious enemy, emerging in the cool, damp nights to feast on her tender seedlings and leafy greens. In the morning, she would find their glistening slime trails, a silvery map of their nightly destruction. She would gather them in the early dawn, and she might employ folk remedies to deter them, such as a border of sharp-edged sand or crushed shells around her most precious plants, or perhaps a simple trap made from a hollowed-out vegetable filled with a little stale ale. Aphids, tiny sap-sucking insects, could colonize her beanstalks in dense, teeming masses, weakening the plants and reducing their yield. Larger creatures were also a threat. Birds would peck at her ripening peas. Mice and voles would burrow into the soil, nibbling at the roots of her vegetables. The constant pressure from these myriad pests was a source of immense frustration. It was a daily reminder that she was not in complete control, that her garden was a contested space, and that every single cabbage head or handful of beans that made it to her pot was a small victory in a much larger war. Disease was another, more mysterious and frightening threat. She had no understanding of fungal spores or bacterial infections. To her, a sudden blight or mildew that appeared on her plants was a malevolent and inexplicable visitation. A patch of white, powdery mildew on her pea leaves, or a dark, rotting blight that spread through her greens, was often seen as a sign of bad luck, a punishment from God, or even the result of a curse from an envious neighbor. She had few effective remedies. She might try a wash made from a bitter herb, or she might simply cut away the diseased parts in the hope of stopping the spread. But more often than not, she could only watch helplessly as the mysterious affliction claimed her plants. Another blow to her hopes for a bountiful harvest. The anxious zenith of high summer was therefore a period of profound paradox. The garden was at its most beautiful, its most productive, and its most generous. The daily meals were fresh, green, and flavorful. But at the same time, the garden was at its most fragile, besieged on all sides by drought, storms, pests, and diseases. The woman's joy in the abundance was always tempered by the fear of losing it. Her work was no longer about coaxing life from the cold earth. It was about protecting that life from the many dangers that threatened to snatch it away. Every day was a new assessment of threats, a new series of small, defensive battles, and all the while, she knew that the season was turning once more. The days were beginning to shorten, the nights were growing cooler, and the great final task of the garden year of the harvest was fast approaching. As the fierce heat of high summer began to yield to the golden, mellow light of autumn, a new sense of urgency filled the garden. This was the time of the harvest, the culmination of the entire year's labor. But the peasant woman's harvest was a world away from the great, communal, and often boisterous harvest of the Lord's fields. There, the reaping of the grain was a public event, a massive mobilization of the entire village's labor, often accompanied by songs, feasts, and rituals. The woman's harvest, by contrast, was a quieter, more protracted, and intensely personal affair. It was not a single event, but a series of careful, deliberate acts of gathering and preservation, performed with the sober understanding that every single bean, every single root, was a crucial weapon in the coming war against winter's hunger. It was not a harvest of abundance, it was a harvest of scarcity. Her gathering began early and continued throughout the season. Many of her vegetables were harvested on a daily basis for immediate use in the pottage pot. She would pick the outer leaves of the coleworts, allowing the central plant to continue producing. She would pull radishes and young onions as they were needed. But the main autumn harvest was focused on the crops that could be preserved, the foods that would have to sustain her family through the long, lean months from November to March. Her primary focus was on the legumes. The peas and broad beans that had been so tender and sweet in the summer were now left on the vines to mature and dry. She would watch them carefully, waiting for the pods to turn yellow, then brown and brittle, rattling with the hard, dry seeds within. She would then gather these dried vines, carrying them into the hovel to be shelled. This was a task for the evenings, performed by the flickering light of the hearth. She, and perhaps her children, would sit for hours, splitting open the dry, papery pods and collecting the hard, dense peas and beans. These were her winter proteins, her poor man's meat. Once shelled, they would be stored in cloth sacks or earthenware jars, kept in the driest part of the cottage, away from the ever-present threat of damp and mice. A full sack of dried peas was a beautiful sight, a tangible measure of security against the coming cold. Next came the root vegetables. The parsnips, turnips, and carrots, if she grew them, had been swelling in the earth all summer. The first frosts of autumn were actually a blessing for these crops, as the cold shock would convert some of their starches into sugars, making them sweeter and more palatable. The harvest of these was a heavy, earthy task. She would use her spade to carefully loosen the soil around each root before pulling it from the ground. It was satisfying work, the unearthing of a hidden treasure. A long, straight, unblemished parsnip was a small masterpiece, a testament to her good soil and careful tending. Preserving these roots was a challenge in an age without refrigeration. The most common method was to store them in a clamp. She would dig a pit in a dry, sheltered spot, perhaps in the floor of the hovel itself, or just outside. She would line the pit with a layer of straw or dry sand, then carefully place the roots in the pit, making sure they did not touch each other. She would then cover them with another layer of sand and straw, and finally with a mound of earth, creating a small, insulated underground cellar. In this cool, dark, and slightly humid environment, the roots could remain fresh and edible for several months, to be unearthed one by one, as needed for the winter pottage. The onions and garlic were harvested when their green tops began to yellow and fall over. She would pull them from the ground and leave them to cure for several days in the autumn sun, allowing their outer skins to become dry and papery. Then, she would braid their dried tops together into long, beautiful ropes. These braids would be hung from the rafters of the hovel, near the warmth and smoke of the hearth. Here, they would stay dry and well ventilated, protected from rot, and easily accessible for her daily cooking. The sight of thick, heavy braids of onions and garlic hanging from the ceiling was a powerful symbol of a well-stocked larder, and their pungent, savory aroma would perfume the small cottage throughout the winter. The hardy cabbages were often one of the last things to be harvested, as they could withstand several hard frosts. Some would be eaten fresh, but others would be preserved. She might shred them and salt them down in a large crock, creating a form of sauerkraut, a tangy, fermented food that would provide a welcome source of sharpness and vital nutrients during the monotonous winter diet. One of the most critical and often overlooked tasks of the autumn harvest was the saving of the seeds. This was an act of profound foresight, a conscious link in an unbroken chain of cultivation that stretched back for generations. The woman was not just a grower, she was a plant breeder. Throughout the growing season, she would have been observing her plants with a critical eye. She would have noted which bean plant produced the most pods, which cabbage grew the largest and was most resistant to caterpillars, and which onion formed the biggest bulb. These were her champions, her genetic treasures. She would mark these plants, perhaps with a piece of colored string, and she would not harvest them for food. Instead, she would allow them to complete their full life cycle, to bolt and go to flower, and finally to produce seed. She would gather these seeds with the utmost care, ensuring they were fully mature and dry. She would winnow the seeds, gently blowing away the chaff and debris until only the clean, viable seeds remained. These were the seeds she would carefully package and store, the seeds that held the promise of the next year's garden. In this act, she was not just a passive recipient of nature's bounty, she was an active participant in its evolution, constantly selecting for the traits that would allow her family to better survive in their specific corner of the world. Her seed cache was not just a collection of promises, It was a library of accumulated wisdom. The harvest of scarcity was a season of relentless, methodical work, a race against the shortening days and the coming of the deep winter frosts. But it was also a time of quiet satisfaction. As she looked at her braids of onions, her sacks of peas, and her clumps of roots, she saw more than just food. She saw the physical embodiment of her knowledge, her labor, and her resilience. She had, through her own skill and endless effort, transformed a small patch of dirt into a bastion against the hunger of the coming winter. The garden was now largely empty, a place of stubble and bare earth, but its life force had not vanished. It had simply been transferred indoors, into the larder and the rafters of her small home, where it would continue to sustain her family through the long, dark night of the year. Winter descended upon the medieval landscape, not as a gentle blanket, but as a conquering army. The vibrant colors of autumn were bleached away, replaced by a stark and unforgiving palette of white, gray, and black. The wind grew teeth, howling around the flimsy walls of the peasant's hovel. The ground, once soft and yielding, became as hard and impenetrable as iron. For the peasant woman, winter was the season of containment, of waiting, and of a deep, abiding cold that seemed to seep into the very marrow of her bones. Her garden, the scene of so much life and labor, was now a place of apparent death. It lay barren and silent under a shroud of snow or a crust of frozen mud. The skeletal remains of a few tough cabbage stalks might poke through the snow, stark and black against the white. It was a place of ghosts, a memory of the green abundance that now seemed a distant dream. Her active physical relationship with the garden was severed. There was no digging, no planting, no weeding, and no watering. The daily rhythmic work that had structured her life in 9 months of the year was gone, replaced by a profound and sometimes unsettling stillness. Yet, to assume that her connection to the garden was broken would be to misunderstand its true nature. The garden, even in its winter dormancy, remained a powerful presence in her life. It was a place of memory and of future promise, a barren hope that sustained her through the darkest days. She would look out at the frozen plot from the doorway of her smoky cottage, and she would not see an empty space. She would see a map of the past and a blueprint for the future. She would remember where the beans had grown tallest and where the onions had swelled largest. She would be planning, in her mind, the rotations for the coming year, knowing that to plant the same crop in the same spot year after year would be to invite disease and deplete the soil. Her mind was still at work in the garden, even when her hands could not be. The life of the garden had not vanished. It had retreated indoors, and her relationship with it now centered on the hearth and the larder. The pottage pot, which bubbled over the central fire day after day, was the warm, beating heart of the winter household, and it was the ghost of her summer garden. Every meal was an act of communion with the labor of the past. As she dropped a handful of hard, dry peas into the simmering water, she could remember the sight of the green vines, heavy with pods in the summer sun. As she chopped a parsnip or a turnip pulled from the cold earth of the clamp, she remembered the satisfaction of unearthing it, its pale flesh, a hidden treasure. As she reached up to the rafters to cut a pungent onion from its braid, she was reconnected to the long, hot days of the harvest. The winter pottage was a thick, nourishing, but often monotonous stew. Its base was the dried peas, beans, and grains. Into this, she would slice the root vegetables and the precious onions. Flavor came from a pinch of salt, if she could afford it, and perhaps from a handful of dried herbs, thyme, sage, or parsley, that she had gathered and dried in the autumn. On a rare and fortunate day, a small piece of salted pork or a bone might be added to the pot, its richness lending a savory depth to the meal. This was the taste of survival. It was the slow, careful expenditure of the wealth she had accumulated in her garden. She was the treasurer of her family's caloric bank account, and her daily task was to make the withdrawals last until the spring. The winter months were a time of indoor labor. With the demands of the garden suspended, she would turn to other tasks. She would spend the long, dark evenings spinning wool or flax by the firelight, her hands engaged in another kind of patient, productive rhythm. She would mend the family's worn clothing, patch the leaking roof of the hovel with fresh thatch, and care for her children, who were now confined to the small, smoky space of the cottage. And all the while, she would be listening. She would listen to the howl of the wind, gauging its ferocity. She would watch the sky, noting the character of the snow and the length of the days. She was still connected to the natural world, still reading its signs, waiting for the first signal that the long, cold siege was beginning to break. The garden in winter was also a place of stark lessons. A harsh winter could freeze the ground so deeply that it killed the roots she had stored in her clamp. A desperate, starving rodent could find a way into her larder and spoil her sacks of dried peas. The death of a family member from one of the many winter illnesses was a common and heartbreaking tragedy. Winter was a constant reminder of the fragility of life, of the thinness of the barrier that she and her garden had erected against the forces of hunger and cold. But even in the deepest, darkest days of winter, the garden remained a symbol of hope. Buried deep beneath the frost and snow lay the soil, resting, gathering its strength, and stored away in their small, dry pouches were the seeds, the tiny, sleeping emblems of rebirth. The woman knew, with a certainty that was as deep and unshakable as the frozen earth itself, that the sun would return, the days would lengthen, the snow would melt, the ground would soften, and she would once again be able to go out, her spade in her hand, and begin the great, sacred cycle all over again. The barren, frozen garden was not an ending, it was a promise. It was the quiet, necessary pause that made the green tide of spring not just possible, but miraculous. The physical garden, with its cycle of labor from the cold awakening of spring to the barren hope of winter, was the central stage of the peasant woman's life. But to fully understand its significance, we must look beyond the soil and the plants. We must look to the unseen garden, the garden of the mind, the repository of knowledge, folklore, and a deep, intuitive wisdom that was cultivated and passed down through generations. This unseen garden was the true source of the woman's power. It was a form of knowledge that was entirely female, entirely oral, and almost completely invisible to the formal, literate, male-dominated world of the manor, the church, and the state. This knowledge was a complex and sophisticated system of practical science, learned through a lifetime of direct observation and trial and error. It was a science of the specific, not the general. A university-trained physician might read the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates and speak of balancing the four humors in the abstract. But the peasant woman knew, with an unshakable certainty, that a poultice made from the crushed leaves of the comfrey plant would help to soothe a sprain and mend a broken bone. She knew that a tea brewed from the flowers of the chamomile plant would calm a colicky baby and help an anxious mind to find sleep. She knew that chewing on the bark of the willow tree would ease a headache, a folk wisdom that modern science would later validate with the discovery of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Her garden was her pharmacy. Tucked in among the pottage herbs and vegetables were her medicinal plants. She grew sage, which she used for everything from treating fevers to cleaning teeth. She grew thyme, a powerful antiseptic, which she would use in washes for cuts and scrapes. She grew fennel to ease digestive complaints and hyssop for coughs and lung ailments. This was not a random collection of herbs. It was a carefully curated living medicine cabinet, each plant chosen for its proven efficacy in treating the common illnesses and injuries that plagued her family. When a child fell and cut their knee, she did not rush for a priest. She rushed for the yarrow growing in her garden, a plant known as woundwort, for its remarkable ability to staunch the flow of blood. This knowledge was transmitted through the most powerful and enduring of educational systems, the bond between mother and daughter. From the time a young girl was old enough to walk, she would be in the garden with her mother. She learned not by reading, for she could not read, but by doing. She learned by watching, by listening, and by imitating. Her mother would show her how to distinguish a useful herb from a poisonous weed. She would teach her the right way to hold the hoe, the right depth to plant a seed, and the right time to harvest a root. She would pass on the hundreds of small, crucial pieces of information that constituted the art of survival. The garden was a young girl's first and most important classroom, and her mother was her most important teacher. The knowledge she absorbed there would be the most valuable inheritance she would ever receive. This practical, scientific knowledge was interwoven with a rich and ancient tapestry of folklore, superstition, and what we might call magic. The woman's worldview was not neatly divided into the rational and the irrational. For her, the world was a deeply enchanted place, animated by unseen forces and spirits, and the garden was a primary site of interaction with these forces. Her gardening practices were a blend of sound, horticultural technique, and magical ritual, and in her mind, the two were inseparable. She would have paid close attention to the phases of the moon. This was not mere superstition. It was an ancient form of agricultural wisdom, she would plant her root crops, the parsnips, turnips, and carrots during the waning of the moon, believing that as the moon's light diminished, the energy of the plant would be drawn downwards into the earth, producing larger, healthier roots. Conversely, she would plant her above-ground crops, the beans, peas, and leafy greens, during the waxing of the moon, believing that, as the moon grew in the sky, it would draw the energy of the plants upwards, promoting strong, vigorous growth. This practice of lunar gardening, while dismissed for centuries by formal science, is now being re-examined, with some modern studies suggesting that the moon's gravitational pull can indeed affect the movement of water in the soil and the germination of seeds. Her relationship with the plants themselves was often personal and animistic. She might whisper to her seeds as she planted them, encouraging them to grow strong. She might believe that certain plants had their own spirits, their own personalities. She would know to approach a powerful medicinal herb with respect, perhaps leaving a small offering, a drop of milk, a piece of bread at its base before she harvested it. This was a way of acknowledging the plant's life force, of entering into a reciprocal relationship rather than simply taking what she needed. The garden was also a place of protection against the malevolent forces that she believed were a constant presence in her world. She might plant certain herbs not for food or medicine, but for their magical properties. A sprig of rowan might be tied above the garden gate to ward off evil spirits. A border of marigolds might be planted to deter the evil eye of an envious neighbor. These were acts of magical fortification, an attempt to create a safe, sacred space for her family in a dangerous and unpredictable world. The lore of the garden was also filled with divination and prophecy. The way a seed sprouted, the shape of a vegetable, and the first flower to bloom could be read as omens, signs of the family's future fortune. The success or failure of the garden was not just a matter of agriculture. It was a reflection of the family's moral and spiritual state. A sudden blight on the cabbages might be seen as a punishment for some transgression, a sign of divine displeasure. A surprisingly bountiful harvest was a sign of favor, a blessing upon the household. This unseen garden of knowledge and folklore was the source of the woman's deep resilience. It gave her a sense of agency, a set of tools, both practical and spiritual, with which to navigate her precarious existence. It empowered her, making her the undisputed expert of her own small domain. And it was this very power, this secret, female-held knowledge of the earth and its hidden properties, that made her a figure of both respect and suspicion in the eyes of the wider community. Her garden was a place of life and healing, but to those who did not understand it, it could also appear to be a place of strange and dangerous secrets. The peasant woman's garden did not exist in isolation. Though it was a private, enclosed space, it was deeply embedded in the complex social fabric of the medieval village. It was a reflection of her family's status, a stage for her interactions with her neighbors, and a constant, tangible reminder of her subservient relationship to the lord of the manor. The simple wattle fence that surrounded her patch of earth was a permeable barrier, and the life of the garden was always spilling out into the community, just as the life of the community was always pressing in upon the garden. For the woman herself, a successful garden was a powerful source of social currency. In a community where status was everything, a neat, well-tended, and productive pottage plot was a public declaration of her skill, her industry, and her worth as a wife and mother. A woman whose garden was a riot of healthy vegetables, whose cabbages were large, and whose onions were plump, was a woman to be respected. Her neighbors would see her as a good manager, a hard worker, and a woman who provided well for her family. Conversely, a garden that was neglected, choked with weeds, and filled with stunted, sickly plants was a source of public shame. It marked a woman as lazy, incompetent, or perhaps simply unlucky, any of which could lower her standing in the tight-knit, judgmental world of the village. The garden was a mirror, and it reflected her character for all to see. This created a complex dynamic of cooperation and competition among the women of the village. On the one hand, the gardens could be a source of community and mutual support. Women would often share or trade seeds, ensuring that a good, strong strain of pea or cabbage was distributed throughout the village. If a woman had a surplus of a particular vegetable, she might share it with a neighbor whose own crop had failed. They would lean over their fences, exchanging advice, complaining about the weather, and sharing the small triumphs and frustrations of their daily work. The gardens were a network, a living, green web that connected the women of the village, a a space where they could converse and commiserate away from the ears of their men. But on the other hand, this proximity and shared interest could also breed jealousy and conflict. Envy was a powerful and corrosive force in the medieval village. A woman whose garden was conspicuously more successful than her neighbors might become the target of resentment and suspicion. A sudden, inexplicable failure in one garden, such as a blight or a pest infestation, could easily be blamed on the malevolent magic of a neighbor. The belief in the evil eye, the power of an envious glance to cause harm, was widespread and deeply felt. A woman might accuse a neighbor of cursing her crops, a serious accusation that could lead to a bitter and lasting feud. The garden, a place of life and nourishment, could also become the focal point of the darkest aspects of village social dynamics. Theft was another constant and very real social threat. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, a garden full of ripening vegetables was a powerful temptation. The thief was most likely not a stranger but another villager, someone whose own garden had failed or whose family was simply more desperate. The theft of a few cabbages or a handful of beans was not a trivial matter. It was the theft of food from the mouths of her children. This is why the simple fence around the garden was so important. It was a physical and symbolic line, a declaration of ownership, and a plea for respect. But a flimsy wattle fence was little deterrent to a truly hungry person, and the woman would be constantly vigilant, especially as the harvest approached, guarding her precious produce from the desperation of her own community. The most significant social relationship that defined the garden, however, was the one that reached down from the top of the feudal pyramid. The garden may have been the woman's domain, but the land itself, like all the land of the manor, belonged to the lord. And the lord, through his agent, the reeve, had a right to a share of its produce. This right was exercised through the collection of tithes and rents in kind. The arrival of the reeve in the village to collect these dues was a moment of great anxiety. He would go from cottage to cottage, inspecting the gardens and claiming the lord's share. He would, of course, select the very best of what he saweth, the largest cabbage, the plumpest onions, and the finest beans. The woman had no power to refuse. She could only stand by silently, as the fruits of her labor were carried away to the manor house kitchen. This was a bitter and resentful transaction. The food she had carefully nurtured to feed her own family was being taken to feed the well-fed household of the lord. It was a stark and constant reminder of her powerlessness, of her place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The garden, her small space of autonomy, was ultimately not her own. It was subject to the same iron laws of obligation and exploitation that governed every other aspect of her life. And so, the social garden was a place of profound contradictions. It was a source of pride and a source of shame. It was a nexus of community and a hotbed of conflict. It was a space of female autonomy that was ultimately controlled by male authority. It was a microcosm of the medieval village itself, a place where the daily struggle for survival was played out, not just against the forces of nature, but against the complex and often brutal forces of human society. We have spent a long time in this small, muddy patch of earth. We have felt the cold, wet soil of spring, the relentless heat of summer, and the quiet, barren hope of winter. We have walked with the peasant woman through the cycle of her year, a year defined by a rhythm of unending labor, of constant anxiety, and of a deep, profound, and resilient knowledge. Her garden was a universe, a place that was simultaneously a farm, a pharmacy, a laboratory, and a battlefield. It was a place of utter necessity, where the stakes were nothing less than the life and health of her family. This world seems impossibly distant from our own. We live in an age of supermarkets, of global supply chains, of a staggering abundance of food that is utterly disconnected from the soil and the seasons. We have forgotten what it means to live by the strength of our own hands and the grace of a small patch of earth. We have forgotten the taste of a vegetable that has been nurtured from a tiny, hopeful seed. We have forgotten the deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from providing for oneself. But the legacy of the peasant woman's garden is not entirely lost. It endures, not in grand monuments, but in the humble, persistent things. It endures in the heirloom seeds, passed down through generations, that are now being rediscovered by modern gardeners. It endures in the folk wisdom of herbal remedies, which are once again being recognized for their gentle power. It endures in the growing movement towards local, sustainable agriculture, a movement that seeks to rebuild the intimate connection between the food we eat and the land it comes from. The story of this forgotten garden is, In the end, a story of resilience. It is a testament to the ability of ordinary people, and especially of women, to create life and hope in the most difficult of circumstances. It is a reminder that even within the most rigid and oppressive of systems, it is possible to cultivate a small space of one's own, a place of knowledge, of power, and of dignity. We have journeyed through the muddy, pragmatic earth of the peasant's patch, a garden of raw survival. Now, we prepare to cross a threshold. We approach a high stone wall, weathered by centuries of rain and sun. Before us is a heavy gate of iron-bound oak. As we pass through, the gate closes behind us with a deep, final sound, the bolt sliding home, not with a clang, but with a dull, resonant thud. The clamor of the world is silenced. The air inside is different. It is cooler, quieter, and fragrant with the scent of damp stone, herbs, and stillness. We have left the world of necessity and entered the world of intention. We have come to the monastic enclosure, the garden of the soul and the spirit. This was the domain of the medieval nun, a world defined by the unyielding rhythm of the divine office, the 7 daily services of prayer and chant that structured every waking moment. It was a life of devotion, of scholarship, and of profound, life-altering enclosure. The women who lived within these walls came from a different stratum of society than the peasant. They were often the daughters of the nobility, the gentry, and the wealthy merchant class. Their hands were not calloused by the digging of heavy soil, but their souls were often burdened by a different kind of toil. And the garden that lay at the heart of their world was a space of breathtaking complexity, a place that was at once a paradise and a prison, a pharmacy and a library, a place of divine contemplation and of dark, dangerous, human secrets. To understand the garden of the nunnery, we must first understand its soul, its guiding metaphor. This was the hortus conclusus, a Latin phrase from the biblical Song of Songs. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. In medieval Christian theology, this verse was interpreted as a direct reference to the Virgin Mary, her purity, and her inviolate womb. By extension, the nun, as a bride of Christ, was to emulate this ideal. Her own soul was to be a hortus conclusus, a walled garden, protected from the sins and temptations of the outside world, a place of pristine, spiritual beauty cultivated for God alone. The physical garden within the convent walls was the living embodiment of this profound theological concept. Every element of its design was imbued with a deep and resonant symbolism. The high, impenetrable stone walls were the most obvious feature. On a practical level, they provided security and seclusion. They kept out the noise, the chaos, and the physical dangers of the medieval world. They created a space of peace and order, a sanctuary where a life of prayer and contemplation could be pursued without distraction. But these walls were also a powerful spiritual and psychological barrier. They represented the vow of enclosure, the renunciation of the secular world. For a woman who had entered the convent with a true and fervent calling, these walls were a welcome embrace, a shield that protected her sacred commitment. They were the ramparts of her spiritual fortress, defending her soul from the assaults of worldly desire. However, for a great many women, these walls were not a choice. In the intricate chess game of medieval dynastic politics, unmarried daughters were often a liability or a bargaining chip. A convent was a convenient and respectable place to house a daughter for whom a suitable marriage could not be found, or a daughter whose inheritance was needed to consolidate a brother's estate. These women were given to the church as a kind of living dowry, their lives dedicated to God, not by their own will, but by the will of their fathers. For these unwilling nuns, the high stone walls were not the embrace of a sanctuary. They were the cold, unyielding arms of a prison. The garden, with its beauty and its peace, was the only nature they would ever know again. The scent of a rose, the warmth of the sun on a stone bench, the sound of a bird singing in the apple trees were the sensory limits of their physical world. The wall that guaranteed their purity also guaranteed their perpetual confinement. The garden, for them, was a beautiful cage, a daily reminder of the freedom they had lost. The same space could be a paradise to one soul, and a place of exquisite torment to another, a place to contemplate the divine, and a place to mourn a stolen life. This profound duality, this tension between sanctuary and prison, was built into the very stones of the convent wall, and it infused the garden with a deep and often sorrowful psychological complexity. At the very heart of the cloister garden, there was often a well or a fountain. This was the garden's source of life, providing the water needed to sustain its plants. But its significance was far deeper. The fountain was a powerful symbol of baptism, of spiritual cleansing and rebirth. It represented the fons vitae, the fountain of life, from which all grace and salvation flowed. The gentle, constant sound of splashing water was a perpetual auditory reminder of the ever-present grace of God, a liquid counterpoint to the chanted psalms that echoed from the adjoining chapel. To sit by the fountain was to sit at the very source of spiritual nourishment, to cleanse one's soul in its symbolic waters. The layout of the garden was a further expression of this divine order. Unlike the peasant's pragmatic patch, the monastic garden was often a model of geometric perfection. The paths would be laid out in the form of a cross, dividing the garden into 4 equal quadrants. This cruciform design transformed the entire space into a living symbol of Christ's sacrifice. To walk the paths of the garden was to walk a path of meditation, to physically trace the sign of the cross upon the earth, and to engage in a form of walking prayer. The 4 quadrants themselves were often interpreted as representing the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 Gospels, or the 4 rivers of paradise. The garden was a diagram of the cosmos, a perfectly ordered and rational model of God's creation, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed, and chaotic nature that existed beyond the walls. Even the plants themselves were chosen and arranged for their symbolic meaning as much as for their practical use. The white lily, with its pristine petals and golden stamen, was the ultimate symbol of the Virgin's purity, a constant reminder of the ideal to which the nuns aspired. The red rose, while associated with courtly love in the secular world, was here reinterpreted as a symbol of the blood of the Christian martyrs, its thorns a reminder of their suffering and sacrifice. Violets, with their humble low-growing habit and sweet scent, represented humility. The evergreen leaves of ivy or boxwood, used for edging the garden beds, symbolized eternal life and the immortality of the soul. The garden was a living text, a botanical catechism where every leaf, every flower, and every pathway was a lesson in theology, a trigger for pious contemplation. It was a space designed not just to feed the body, but to instruct and elevate the soul. While we often speak of the monastic garden, in reality, a large and well-established nunnery would have contained a series of distinct, specialized gardens, each with its own specific function and character. The convent was a complex, self-sufficient community, and its gardens were a reflection of this, a carefully designed landscape that provided for all the needs of the sisters, from the earthly to the sublime. The most central of these was the cloister garth, the open quadrangle of green space enclosed by the 4 covered walkways of the cloister. This was the symbolic and spiritual heart of the monastery. It was typically a simple lawn of turf, perhaps with a single tree, a fountain, or a well at its center. This was not a productive garden, but a contemplative one. It was a space of pure symbolism, an oasis of green serenity that provided light and air to the surrounding buildings, the chapel, the chapter house, the refectory, and the dormitory. The nuns would pass through the covered walkways on their way to their daily duties, their eyes drawn to the simple, ordered beauty of the garth, a constant, calming presence at the center of their enclosed world. Connected to the kitchen and the refectory would be the kitchen garden, or hortus. This was the convent's equivalent of the peasant's pottage plot, but it was a world away in its scale, its order, and its diversity. Here, under the care of a designated kitchener sister, a wide variety of vegetables and herbs would be cultivated in neat, well-tended beds. They would grow the same staples as the peasantinians: leeks, garlic, peas, beans, and cabbages, but they would also have access to a wider and more refined range of produce. They might grow lettuces and other salad greens, root vegetables like carrots and parsnips, and a greater variety of culinary herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, and savory. The kitchen garden was a place of disciplined productivity, its purpose to provide the fresh, wholesome provender for the communal meals in the refectory. The diet of a well-run nunnery, while simple and often meatless, was far more varied and nutritious than that of the peasantry, thanks in large part to the bounty of its well-managed kitchen garden. Beyond the main complex of buildings, there would often be an orchard, or papmerium. This was a place of immense value, a long-term investment in the community's sustenance. Here, rows of fruit trees were carefully cultivated. Apples and pears were the most common, providing fruit that could be eaten fresh, cooked into sauces, or, most importantly, pressed into cider and perry. A strong fermented cider was a staple beverage in many monasteries. a safer and more nutritious drink than the often contaminated water. The orchard might also contain plum, damson, and cherry trees, and in warmer climates, perhaps even figs or quinces. The orchard in blossom in the spring was a sight of breathtaking beauty, a living symbol of rebirth and promise. In the autumn, its heavy-laden branches were a testament to the community's foresight and stability. A quieter, more somber garden was the cemetery. This was the sisters' final resting place, often a simple grassy plot planted with trees and flowers that symbolized death and resurrection, such as the yew, the cypress, and the lily. It was a place of remembrance and of hope, a garden where the bodies of the departed sisters were returned to the earth to await the final resurrection. It was a tangible reminder of the transience of earthly life and the promise of the eternal paradise to come. But of all the specialized gardens within the convent walls, the most important, the most complex, and the one that held the greatest source of female power and knowledge was the infirmary garden, known as the herbularius or the hortus sanitatis, the garden of health. This was the domain of the sister infirmaris. It was a place that was at once a laboratory, a pharmacy, and a sanctuary. It was here that the practical, life-saving knowledge of the monastic woman found its fullest expression, and it was a place that held the secrets of both healing and harm in its fragrant, leafy beds. Within the ordered hierarchy of the nunnery, the sister infirmaris held a position of immense responsibility and respect. She was the community's healer, its doctor, its nurse, and its pharmacist. In an age of rampant disease, high mortality rates, and a medical science that was often more harmful than helpful, the infirmaris was a figure of profound practical importance. The infirmary, the special building set aside for the care of the sick and the elderly sisters, was her domain, and the infirmary garden was her most essential tool. The woman chosen for this role was often one of the most intelligent, observant, and literate members of the community. Her training was a rigorous and multifaceted education. She would have had access to the convent's library and scriptorium, where she could study the great medical texts of the past. These would have included Latin translations of Greek and Roman authors like Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen, whose theories of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, formed the bedrock of official medieval medicine. She would have also studied the works of later encyclopedists like Isidore of Seville. This textual knowledge provided her with a theoretical framework for understanding disease, but her education was not purely academic. It was also deeply rooted in the practical, herbal traditions that had been passed down through generations of women. She would have served a long apprenticeship under the previous infirmaress, learning the secrets of the garden not from a book, but through direct hands-on experience. She would learn to identify hundreds of different plants by sight, by touch, and by smell. She would learn the precise time of day, the phase of the moon, and the season of the year to harvest each leaf, flower, or root to ensure its maximum potency. She would master the complex art of preparation, learning how to dry, crush, infuse, decoct, and distill her botanical ingredients to create a vast arsenal of remedies. Her daily routine was one of quiet, methodical care. At dawn, after the first service of matins, she might walk through her garden, her robes brushing against the dew-laden leaves. This was a time of observation. She would inspect her plants, checking for signs of disease or pestilence, her trained eye noticing the slightest change in a leaf's color or texture. She would decide which herbs were ready for harvesting and would gather them with a small, sharp knife, placing them carefully in a wicker basket. Her movements would be slow, deliberate, and respectful, a communion with the living things that held the power to heal. Back in the infirmary, she had a preparation room, an early kind of pharmacy. Here, she would process her harvest. Some herbs would be tied in bunches and hung from the rafters to dry, their fragrant, medicinal scent filling the air. Others would be used fresh, crushed with a mortar and pestle to release their juices for a poultice. Roots would be scrubbed, clean and chopped for a decoction. Flowers might be infused in oil or wine. She was a master of a gentle botanical chemistry, transforming the raw materials of her garden into a sophisticated materia medica. Her work was also that of a skilled diagnostician and nurse. When a sister fell ill, it was the infirmaris who would be called. She would examine the patient, her approach a blend of scientific theory and intuitive wisdom. She would take a pulse. She would inspect the color of the patient's urine, a key diagnostic tool in humoral theory. She would ask questions, listen to the patient's complaints, and make a diagnosis. Her treatments were holistic. She would prescribe a specific herbal remedy, a bitter tea to reduce a fever, a soothing syrup for a cough, or a cleansing poultice for a wound. But she would also prescribe a specific diet, drawing upon the resources of the kitchen garden, and she would offer spiritual comfort, praying with the patient and offering words of reassurance. The infirmary itself was designed to be a place of healing. It was often one of the best lit and best ventilated buildings in the convent, with windows that opened onto the infirmary garden. The very sight and scent of the garden were considered to be part of the cure, a form of restorative therapy for the sick. The infirmaress was more than just a dispenser of herbal remedies. She was the custodian of a complex, integrated system of healthcare, a system that understood the deep and inextricable link between the health of the body, the state of the mind, and the well-being of the soul. Her garden was the living, breathing heart of this entire system. Let us now walk the fragrant paths of the infirmary garden and examine some of the key plants in the Sister Infirmaress's living apothecary. Each plant was a chapter in her book of cures, a specific tool for a specific ailment. At the very heart of the garden, one would certainly find sage salvia officinae. The very name of this herb, derived from the Latin salvare, to save or to heal, speaks to its immense importance. It was considered a cure-all, a powerful and versatile medicine. A tea made from its soft grayish-green leaves was used to treat fevers, to soothe sore throats, to aid digestion, and to calm the nerves. Its antiseptic properties made it an excellent mouthwash and a cleansing agent for wounds. A medieval proverb asked, "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" For the infirmaress, sage was the indispensable foundation of her practice. Nearby would be rosemary, Rosmarinus officinalis, the dew of the sea. This woody, evergreen shrub with its pungent piney scent was associated with memory and the mind. It was used to treat headaches, to improve concentration, and to lift the spirits. The smoke from burning rosemary was used to fumigate the sickroom, a form of early aromatherapy and a practical way to disinfect the air. Its oil, infused in wine, was used as a stimulating liniment for aching joints. Thyme, Thymus vulgaris, a low-growing aromatic herb, was another powerful antiseptic. Its name is derived from a Greek word meaning to fumigate. A strong tea of thyme was a primary remedy for coughs, bronchitis, and other respiratory ailments. Its ability to expel phlegm and soothe the bronchial passages made it an essential winter remedy. It was also used in poultices for infected wounds, its potent essential oils inhibiting the growth of bacteria. For the mending of the body, no plant was more important than Comfrey symphytum officinal. This large, hairy-leaved plant was commonly known as knitbone, and for good reason. The root of the comfrey plant contains a substance called allantoin, which promotes cell proliferation and helps to speed the healing of tissues. The infirmaress would make a thick, black, sticky poultice from the mashed root of comfrey and apply it to sprains, fractures, and deep bruises. The belief in its power to knit broken bones back together was profound, and its efficacy in healing wounds and reducing inflammation was very real. For wounds that were bleeding, the go-to remedy was Yarrow Achillea millefolium. This feathery-leaved herb, also known as woundwort or soldier's woundwort, has powerful astringent properties that help to constrict blood vessels and staunch the flow of blood. A fresh handful of yarrow leaves, crushed and applied directly to a cut, was the medieval equivalent of a styptic pencil and a bandage, all in one. But the garden did not only treat the ailments of the body, it also ministered to the mind and the spirit. The enclosed, disciplined, and often stressful life of the convent could take a heavy toll on the nervous system. Anxiety, melancholy, and insomnia were common complaints. For these, the infirmaress would turn to her calming herbs. The most beloved of these was surely lavender, Lavandula angustifolia. The very scent of lavender is synonymous with calm and relaxation. The infirmaress would use its purple flowers to make soothing teas, to stuff small pillows to be placed under the head at night, and to infuse in bathing water. Its gentle, sedative properties were a balm for a troubled mind, a fragrant antidote to the anxieties of the enclosed life. Chamomile Matricaria recutata, with its small daisy-like flowers and sweet, apple-like scent, was another cornerstone of her sedative practice. A warm cup of chamomile tea was a universal prescription for sleeplessness, for nervous tension, and for digestive upset caused by stress. It was gentle enough for the most delicate of constitutions, and was a beloved comfort in the quiet. Often lonely, knights of the infirmary. The knowledge held by the informeress was a precious and powerful thing. It was a form of female learning that existed largely outside the male-dominated universities. It was a science, a tradition, and an art, all cultivated within the sacred, enclosed space of her garden. No account of the medieval monastic garden would be complete without paying homage to its greatest and most brilliant practitioner, the towering figure of Hildegard of Bingen. To call Hildegard a simple herbalist would be a profound understatement. She was a 12th century German abbess, a polymath of staggering genius, a mystic, a composer, a theologian, a political advisor, and a natural scientist. In an age when the voices of women were almost entirely silenced, Hildegard's voice thundered across Europe, offering counsel and condemnation to popes, emperors, and kings. And a significant portion of her monumental body of work was dedicated to the study of the natural world and its relationship to human health. Hildegard's worldview was built upon a central, luminous concept she called viriditas, a Latin term that translates literally as greenness. But for Hildegard, viriditas meant much more than just the color green. It was the divine, life-giving, greening power of God that infused all of creation. It was the force that made the grass grow, the trees leaf out, and the human body heal. To be healthy was to be filled with viriditas. To be sick was to have one's viriditas diminished. The garden, for her, was the ultimate expression of this divine power, a place where the healing greenness of God was made manifest on earth. In her two great medical and scientific works, De Physica and Causae et Curae, Hildegard documented a holistic system of medicine that was centuries ahead of its time. She meticulously described the properties of hundreds of plants, trees, animals, and stones. Her work was not just a repetition of the classical texts. It was based on her own direct, intense, and mystically informed observation of the world around her. She had a unique system of classification, describing plants in terms of their heat and coldness, their wetness and dryness, qualities that corresponded not just to the humoral system, but to her own spiritual understanding of their nature. Her remedies were complex and specific. She would prescribe not just a single herb, but a combination of them, often prepared in wine or mixed with other ingredients like honey or ginger. She was one of the first to write extensively about the medicinal properties of hops, recognizing its value as a sedative and a digestive aid. She praised the healing virtues of the humble nettle, recommending it for its ability to purify the blood. For Hildegard, the act of healing was not just about applying a physical remedy to a physical ailment. It was a spiritual act, a process of restoring the patient's lost viriditas by introducing the divine greening power contained within the plants of her garden. She was the ultimate embodiment of the Sister Infirmaris, a figure whose scientific knowledge was inseparable from her profound spiritual vision. Her garden was not just a source of cures, it was a window into the very mind of God. The garden of the nunnery was a place of healing, of order, and of divine contemplation. It was a testament to the life-giving power of nature and the compassionate wisdom of its keepers. But every garden, no matter how sacred, has its shadows. Every plant that has the power to heal also has the power to harm. The line between a medicine and a poison is often nothing more than a matter of dosage. And the Sister Infirmaris, in her profound knowledge of the garden's secrets, walked this line every single day. Her wisdom encompassed not only the path of healing, but also its dark, terrifying twin, the poison path. This is the most hidden and discomforting aspect of the monastic garden. It is a truth that exists in the whispers of history, in the subtext of the chronicles. The enclosed world of the convent, for all its piety and peace, was still a human world. It was a place of intense social and political pressure, a closed system where resentments could fester, where rivalries could become toxic, and where the desire for power, or for simple escape, could become an all-consuming obsession. And in this claustrophobic environment, the specialized knowledge of the infirmaris and the contents of her garden represented a hidden and terrifying form of agency, tucked away in a corner of the garden, or perhaps growing just beyond the walls, where it could be gathered secretly, were the baneful herbs. These were plants of extraordinary beauty and deadly power. Their presence was a paradox, a dark secret hiding in plain sight. Consider monkshood Aconitum napellus, also known as wolfsbane, with its tall, stately spires of deep purple, helmet-shaped flowers. It is a plant of breathtaking beauty, but it is also one of the most violently poisonous plants in the northern hemisphere. Every part of the plant contains the deadly alkaloid aconitine, A tiny accidental dose can cause numbness, vomiting, and a terrifying paralysis of the heart and respiratory system, leading to a swift and agonizing death. Yet, in the hands of a skilled and incredibly brave herbalist, a minuscule, carefully prepared dose was sometimes used to slow a racing pulse or to reduce the pain of neuralgia. The ephemeris would have known of this plant. She would have known its power. The knowledge of how to prepare a heart-slowing medicine was inseparable from the knowledge of how to prepare a heart-stopping poison. Then there was deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna. Its name, belladonna, or beautiful lady, hints at one of its uses. A drop of its juice would be used to dilate a woman's pupils, a cosmetic effect considered alluring at the time. But the plant's other name, Atropa, comes from Atropos, the Greek fate who held the shears and cut the thread of human life. Its shiny, black berries, so tempting to a child, are lethally toxic. Ingesting them leads to flushed skin, a racing heart, delirium, vivid hallucinations, and finally, death. The infirmary knew of belladonna's power to dilate the pupils, a useful tool for examining the eyes. She also knew of its power to bring madness and death. Foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, another tall and beautiful garden flower, with its cascade of spotted bell-shaped blossoms, contains powerful cardiac glycosides. The ephemeris would have known it as a potent diuretic, a plant that could help to rid the body of excess fluid in cases of dropsy, or what we would now call congestive heart failure. But the knowledge of how to prepare a tea that would stimulate the kidneys and strengthen a failing heart was, once again, indistinguishable from the knowledge of how to prepare a dose that would cause violent vomiting, blurred vision, and a final fatal cardiac arrest. The existence of this knowledge within the convent walls created a silent, terrifying potential. A nun who felt trapped and desperate, who saw no other escape from a lifetime of unwanted confinement, might see in the ephemeris's garden a final dark doorway. A rival for the powerful position of abbess might fall suddenly and mysteriously ill, her symptoms mimicking a natural disease. Her death mourned as a tragedy by the very sister who had administered the fatal dose from a seemingly innocent plant. This is not to say that the convents of the Middle Ages were hotbeds of poisonings, but it is to acknowledge the full weight of the knowledge that the sister ephemeris possessed. She held the keys to both life and death. Her garden, a place of so much good, of so much healing, also contained a hidden, shadowy potential for the ultimate sin. It was a garden of salvation, and it was a garden of profound and terrible temptation. Its serene and ordered beauty concealed a deep and unsettling complexity, a reflection of the complex and often troubled souls who lived their entire lives within its walls. The monastic garden, in all its complexity, offers us a profound and enduring legacy. It is a testament to a worldview in which the spiritual and the practical, the scientific and the sacred, were not separate categories but were deeply and inextricably intertwined. It was a place where the pursuit of knowledge, the practice of healing, and the act of divine worship all flowed together in a single, unified stream. The world of the medieval nun is gone. The great monastic houses fell into ruin or were dissolved. The unified worldview they represented was fractured by the forces of Reformation, revolution, and scientific rationalism. But the echo of their garden has never truly faded. It persists in the quiet order of our own botanical gardens. It lives on in the modern revival of herbal medicine, as scientists now work to isolate the very chemical compounds that Sister Ephemeris knew only through intuition and tradition. And it survives, most powerfully, in the enduring human need for a sanctuary, for a quiet, green, and ordered space where we can retreat from the chaos of the world to heal our bodies, calm our minds, and tend to the gardens of our own souls. The story of this enclosed garden is just one of the many forgotten rooms of history that we seek to unlock and explore here. It is a story of quiet lives and of profound knowledge, a narrative that is often overlooked in the grand chronicles of the past. If you have found a measure of peace, of quiet, or of simple curiosity in walking these fragrant, shadowed paths with us, we invite you to continue the journey. By subscribing to our channel, you ensure that we can continue to open these gates to the past, to tell these whispered stories, and to provide a quiet sanctuary from the noise of the present. Let us take our leave of the silent, sacred cloister, and travel now to a world of silk, of steel, and of intricate, whispered games. The air changes. The solemn scent of incense and medicinal herbs is replaced by the richer perfumes of roasting meat, of wine, of wood smoke, and of the costly fragrances worn by the men and women of the court. We have arrived at the castle, the great, cold, stone heart of secular power in the medieval world, and here, nestled within its formidable defensive walls, we will find another kind of enclosed garden, a space that is as different from the nun's cloister as a tournament is from a prayer. This is the noblewoman's bower, a garden of pleasure, of politics, of vanity, and of profound, often deadly, peril. This garden was not a place of labor, nor was it primarily a place of prayer. It was, above all, a place of leisure and of display. It was a carefully constructed and highly artificial paradise, an earthly echo of a mythical ideal, designed to showcase the wealth, the refined taste, and the social standing of its noble owners. For the lady of the castle, the chatelaine, this garden was one of her primary domains, an extension of the great hall, an outdoor room where the rigid formalities of court life could be softened, and where the complex and often dangerous dramas of her world could be played out against a backdrop of cultivated beauty. To step into this garden is to step onto a stage, and every flower, every bench, and every whispered conversation was a part of the intricate and often ruthless performance of high medieval life. The noble garden, often referred to as a pleasance or a pleasure garden, was a fundamentally different creation from the pragmatic plots of the peasant and the nun. Its design was driven not by the needs of the body or the doctrines of the church, but by the aesthetics of courtly literature and the demands of a leisured aristocratic lifestyle. It was a space designed to delight the senses and to facilitate the complex social rituals of the elite. Like the monastic garden, it was almost always enclosed. A high wall of stone or brick, or a thick, impenetrable hedge of thorn, served to create a space of absolute privacy and exclusivity. This enclosure was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it separated the refined world of the nobility from the muddy, chaotic world of the bailey and the village beyond. It created a sanctuary of clean air and quiet, a retreat from the noise, the smells, and the ever-present animals of the working castle. Symbolically, this walled garden, this hortus conclusus, was a direct borrowing from the romantic and allegorical literature of the age. It was a representation of a perfect, idealized world, a secular Eden where the harsh realities of life, war, disease, politics, and death could, for a brief time, be held at bay. It was a fantasy made real, a private kingdom of beauty within the larger kingdom of stone and steel. Within these walls, the layout was designed for comfort and social interaction. Instead of the cruciform paths of the cloister, the noble garden featured meandering walkways of fine gravel or soft springy turf. These paths were designed for strolling, for conversation, and for the rustle of a silk gown against a flowering border. A key feature of these gardens was the turf bench. This was a raised bank of earth, often built against a wall, which was planted with a thick, smooth carpet of lawn, chamomile, or other low-growing, fragrant herbs. When sat upon, these benches would release their scent, perfuming the air and the clothes of those who rested there. They were the living furniture of the garden, comfortable, fragrant, and perfectly integrated into the green landscape. Water was as central to the pleasure garden as it was to the cloister, but its purpose was aesthetic rather than purely symbolic. A fountain, often intricately carved from stone, with figures from mythology or romance, would form the garden's centerpiece. The sound of its splashing water was not a call to prayer, but a soothing, musical backdrop for conversation and courtship. Its cooling spray offered a welcome relief on a hot summer's day. In the grandest of gardens, a spring might be diverted to feed a small man-made fish pond, stocked with carp or trout. This was both a source of fresh food for the Lord's table and a delightful, shimmering feature, its surface reflecting the sky and the surrounding flowers. The plants that filled this garden were chosen not for their utility in the pottage pot, but for their beauty, their fragrance, and their symbolic resonance. This was the kingdom of the flower. The two queens of this kingdom were, without question, the rose and the lily. The rose, in all its forms, from the wild dog rose to the cultivated damask rose, which was the ultimate symbol of earthly love and beauty. Its deep red color was associated with passion, its intoxicating fragrance with the sensual delights of the world, and its sharp thorns with the pain and dangers that so often accompany love. The lily, particularly the white Madonna lily, was its spiritual counterpart. It was the emblem of purity, of virtue, and of the Virgin Mary, the celestial Queen of Heaven. A garden that contained both the rose and the lily was a landscape that held the two great poles of medieval feminine identity in perfect, beautiful tension: the sensual and the spiritual, the earthly and the divine. Alongside these two monarchs grew a host of other beloved flowers. There were irises, with their regal fleur-de-lis shape, columbines, peonies, and violets. There were pot marigolds, whose bright orange and yellow faces were thought to follow the sun, and periwinkles, whose evergreen leaves symbolized fidelity. Fragrance was as important as color. Borders of lavender, rosemary, and pinks would be planted along the walkways, so that the slightest brush of a passing skirt would release their scent into the air. The garden was an immersive sensory experience, a symphony of color and perfume, designed to enchant and delight. Trees provided shade and structure. Small fruit trees, such as apples, pears, and cherries, were common, their blossoms a cloud of beauty in the spring, and their fruit a welcome treat in the autumn. Shaded walkways, or alleys, were often created by training vines, such as grapevines or climbing roses, over a long, arched wooden trellis or arbor. To walk through such a tunnel on a summer's day was to be enclosed in a cool, green, fragrant world, the sunlight dappling through the leaves, a perfect, intimate space for a private conversation. The noblewoman's garden was, in essence, a work of art. It was as much a product of human design and cultural ideals as a tapestry or an illuminated manuscript. It was a highly controlled and curated version of nature, a space where the wildness of the outside world was tamed, ordered, and transformed into a beautiful and civilized stage. This beautiful stage had a primary and all-consuming purpose. It was the designated theater for the performance of courtly love. Courtly love was the elaborate and highly ritualized code of romantic conduct that dominated the aristocratic imagination of the High Middle Ages. It was a game, a philosophy, and a literary obsession. Born in the courts of southern France, and spread throughout Europe by the songs of the troubadours and the great epic romances of writers like Détron, this code of love was almost entirely extramarital. The marriages of the nobility were political and economic alliances, arranged by families to consolidate power, land, and wealth. They had little to do with personal affection or romantic attraction. Courtly love, therefore, existed in a parallel universe, a fantasy world of intense, idealized, and often unconsummated passion between a knight and a noble lady, who was almost always the wife of another man, often his own lord. The lady was placed upon a pedestal. She was a figure to be worshipped from afar, a source of inspiration who ennobled her knightly lover through the trials and tribulations she set for him. The love was secret, illicit, and fraught with danger, and this very danger was a key part of its appeal. The garden was the natural and preferred setting for this elaborate game. It was a space that was both private and public, a place where lovers could meet away from the prying eyes of the main court, but still be visible enough to maintain the delicate fiction of propriety. The garden was a liminal space, a bridge between the rigid formalities of the great hall and the absolute privacy of the bedchamber. It was a space of suggestion, of nuance, of whispered promises and stolen glances, the great literary allegory of the age. The Roman de la Rose, the romance of the rose, is the ultimate key to understanding the garden's role in this culture. This immensely popular poem tells the story of a lover's quest to pluck a single, perfect rosebud from a magnificent walled garden, a rosebud that is a transparent metaphor for the love of his chosen lady. The garden in the poem is a complex allegorical landscape, populated by characters like Sir Mirth, Courtesy, and Fair Welcome, who help the lover, and by figures like Danger, Shame, and Jealousy, who bar his path. To read the Roman de la Rose was to be given a map to the landscape of love, and the real-life gardens of the nobility were a conscious attempt to recreate this literary ideal. Within this theatrical space, every action was imbued with a heightened, symbolic meaning. The simple act of a lady giving a flower to a knight was a powerful and public statement of her favor. The choice of flower was a message in itself. A red rose was a bold and dangerous declaration of passion. A pansy, or in French, was a hint to think of the giver. A periwinkle signaled fidelity. This silent, floral language, the floriography of the court, allowed for a level of communication that was impossible in the more formal settings of the court. The garden was the setting for all the key rituals of the courtly game. It was here that the knight might recite a poem he had composed in his lady's honor. It was here that musicians would play soft, romantic airs on the lute or the harp. It was here that the lady and her attendants would sit on the turf benches, weaving garlands of flowers to be worn at the evening feast. The choice of flowers in a lady's garland, a subtle signal of her mood and affections. The garden was a place of performance, and the lady of the castle was its principal actress and director, a queen presiding over her small, green, and intensely romantic kingdom. The romantic, idealized facade of the garden, however, concealed a much harder and more dangerous reality. The courtly love on display was often a thin veneer, a civilized game played over a world of brutal political calculation and personal ambition. The garden, with its unique combination of privacy and social acceptability, was not just a stage for love. It was also the primary back room for political intrigue. The Great Hall was a place of public pronouncements and of formal audiences with the Lord. But the real business of the court, the forging of alliances, the spreading of rumors, and the subtle negotiations for power and influence took place in its more private corners. And the garden was the most private corner of all. It was here, strolling along a shaded path, seemingly engaged in idle conversation, that a lesser noble might seek the favor of a powerful baron, or that two factions might broker a secret deal. The lady of the castle was often a key player in this political world. While she held no formal power, a clever and ambitious noblewoman could wield immense influence through her network of personal relationships, her control over her household, and her access to her powerful husband. The garden was her office. It was here that she would meet with her allies, gather intelligence from her ladies-in-waiting, and subtly influence the course of events. A seemingly innocent conversation about flowers with the wife of a visiting dignitary could, in fact, be a delicate probing for political weaknesses or a subtle transmission of a sensitive message. The garden was a place of secrets. A rustling hedge could conceal a spy. A whispered conversation by the fountain could seal a man's fate. The very beauty and tranquility of the setting made it the perfect cover for the dark and dangerous business of the court. The same bower that provided a romantic backdrop for a lover's tryst could also be the site of a whispered plot to overthrow the lord himself. The line between romance and politics was often impossibly thin. A knight's declaration of love for a powerful lady might be a genuine passion, but it could also be a calculated political move, an attempt to gain favor with her or to gain access to the secrets of her husband. The garden was a beautiful but treacherous landscape, where every word had a double meaning and every gesture was a potential move in a deadly game of power. For the lady herself, the garden could be a place of both agency and entrapment. It was one of the few spaces where she could exert a degree of control, where she could shape her environment and conduct her own social and political affairs. But it was also a gilded cage. Her life was a performance, and the garden was her primary stage. She was constantly on display, her every action scrutinized, her reputation a fragile and precious commodity that could be shattered by a single misstep or a malicious rumor. The very privacy that the garden offered was also a source of danger, as an unchaperoned meeting, however innocent, could be used by her enemies to destroy her. The garden, which represented her power and her pleasure, was also a constant reminder of the precariousness of her position. Beyond love and politics, the garden served another, deeply personal function for the noblewoman. It was her private laboratory and her temple, a place dedicated to the relentless and often dangerous pursuit of beauty. In a world where a woman's value was so intimately tied to her physical appearance, and where her marriageability and her status at court depended on it, the maintenance of a youthful and fashionable look was not a matter of simple vanity. It was a matter of survival. The medieval ideal of female beauty was highly specific and difficult to achieve. It centered on a pale, almost translucent complexion, free from freckles or any hint of a suntan, which was the mark of a peasant who labored in the fields. Hair was to be long, thick, and ideally blonde. A high forehead, a small, red mouth, and a slender, willowy figure completed the picture. The garden was the noblewoman's primary source for the ingredients she needed to achieve this demanding and artificial ideal. It was her personal cosmetic kit, her living apothecary of beauty. For the all-important pale complexion, she would cultivate a variety of plants. A lotion made by infusing elderflowers in milk was believed to lighten the skin and fade freckles. The juice of the white lily bulb, or a distillation of rose petals, rose water, was used as a facial toner, believed to refine the pores and create a smooth porcelain-like finish. To soothe skin that had been chapped by the wind or irritated by the harsh lye-based soaps of the age, she would create soothing salves or unguents, using the rendered fat of a pig or sheep as a base, infused with the healing properties of plants like comfrey, mallow, or calendula, or pot marigold. To achieve the fashionable blonde hair, she would concoct powerful bleaching agents from her garden. A rinse made from a mixture of chamomile flowers, broom blossoms, and saffron, applied to the hair before sitting in the sun, was believed to lighten it to a desirable golden hue. The ladies of the court would sit for hours in their gardens, their hair spread out over the wide brim of a special crownless hat, letting the sun and their herbal concoctions work their magic. To add a touch of color to the pale canvas of the face, she would turn to other plants. The roots of the madder plant or the petals of the poppy could be used to create a reddish stain for the cheeks and lips, a subtle and natural-looking blush. The garden was a treasure trove of cosmetic secrets, a place where a woman could harness the power of nature to enhance and transform her appearance, to bring herself closer to the almost unattainable ideal of courtly beauty. But this relentless pursuit of beauty had a dark and toxic side. The desire for an absolutely white, flawless complexion led many noblewomen to use one of the most dangerous cosmetics in history, Venetian Cigusse, a skin-whitening powder made from white lead. This substance provided a thick, opaque, and highly effective white coating, but it was a deadly poison. The lead would be slowly absorbed through the skin, leading to a horrifying array of health problems. It caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, dental decay, and irreversible damage to the nervous system. In a tragic and ironic twist, the lead-based powder would also eat away at the skin, creating blemishes and scars that required an even thicker application of the poison to conceal. The noblewoman would not have grown the lead itself in her garden, but she would have cultivated the plants needed to create the creams and lotions that served as a base for this toxic powder. Her garden, a place she associated with life, health, and natural beauty, was thus an unwitting accomplice in her own slow, self-inflicted poisoning. The same space that provided the soothing chamomile and the healing comfrey also provided the medium for a deadly poison. The altar of beauty was also an altar of self-destruction, and the garden was the temple where these strange and dangerous rites were performed. The quest for a perfect, static, and artificially pale beauty became, for some, a literal dance with death, and the beautiful, fragrant flowers of the pleasance were the silent witnesses to this tragic vanity. The shadows in the noblewoman's garden were not just metaphorical. Just as in the convent, the beautiful, sun-drenched bower concealed a dark and terrible potential. For a noblewoman trapped in a brutal or politically disadvantageous marriage, for a lady facing a dangerous rival at court, or for a family embroiled in a bitter feud, the garden offered a silent, effective, and almost untraceable weapon: poison. The knowledge of poisonous plants was a hidden and dangerous subset of herbal lore. While the Sister Infirmaris studied poisons in the context of their potential medicinal applications, the knowledge in the secular world was often more pragmatic and more sinister. A noblewoman, through her reading of classical texts, through the whispered advice of a wise old servant, or through her own clandestine experimentation, could learn to identify and prepare the most potent toxins that grew, often as decorative and seemingly innocent plants, right in her own garden. The beautiful, drooping, bell-shaped flowers of the foxglove, a common and admired garden ornamental, could be used to prepare a poison that would perfectly mimic a sudden and fatal heart attack. The tall, elegant spires of monkshood, prized for their deep purple color, could yield a poison so swift and so violent that its effects might be mistaken for a seizure or a stroke. The bright, cheerful berries of the yew tree, a common feature in aristocratic gardens, contained a powerful cardiotoxic alkaloid. Even the common and seemingly innocuous laurel wreath, a symbol of victory and honor, had a dark side. The leaves of the cherry laurel, when crushed, released cyanide. This knowledge was a terrifying and ultimate form of female power in a world that afforded women very little direct agency. A woman could not challenge a man with a sword in a duel. She could not raise an army to depose a rival. She could not speak with authority in the councils of men, but she could, with a deep and secret knowledge of her own garden, eliminate an enemy with a chilling efficiency. A few drops of a carefully prepared tincture, colorless and odorless, slipped into a goblet of wine at a feast. A powder ground from a dried root, sprinkled into a dish of pottage, These were the weapons of the powerless, the tools of last resort for a woman pushed to the very edge. The fear of being poisoned was a constant and palpable undercurrent in the high-stakes world of the medieval court. Lords and ladies would employ food tasters. They would drink from special goblets made of agate or cups lined with so-called serpent's tongue, fossilized shark's teeth, which were believed to sweat or change color in the presence of poison. But these were unreliable defenses against a skilled poisoner. The most effective poisons were those that mimicked the symptoms of a natural illness, that killed slowly over a period of weeks or months. A lingering poison that would escape the suspicion of all but the most astute of physicians. The noblewoman's garden, that beautiful, fragrant, and seemingly innocent stage for romance and pleasure, was therefore also a potential arsenal. Its beauty was a perfect camouflage for its deadly potential. The same rose that a lady might give to her lover as a symbol of her passion could be growing next to a foxglove that she intended to use to murder her husband. The garden was a place of profound and unsettling duality. It was the ultimate expression of the refined, civilized, and beautiful ideals of the courtly world, and at the same time it was a secret, hidden repository of its most brutal, ruthless, and deadly impulses. It was a paradise with a serpent lurking beneath every flower. The forgotten garden of the medieval noblewoman was, in the end, a perfect metaphor for her own existence. It was a gilded cage. It was a space of incredible beauty, of refined pleasure, and of significant, albeit indirect, power. Within its walls, she could create a world of her own, a world of aesthetic perfection, of social grace, and of intimate intrigue. She could be a patron of the arts, a player in the great game of politics, or a master of the subtle language of love and favor. But it was a cage nonetheless. The same walls that protected her from the outside world also confined her, limiting her freedom and her sphere of action. Her life, like her garden, was a highly artificial creation, a constant performance governed by a rigid set of rules and expectations. And beneath the beautiful, fragrant surface of her life, there were always shadows. The constant threats of political machination, of personal betrayal, and of the dark, secret knowledge that bloomed, silent and deadly, among the beautiful flowers of her bower. The world of the noblewoman's pleasance has vanished. The specific codes of courtly love are a historical curiosity. The great castles now stand as romantic ruins, but the echo of her garden, and of the complex life she lived within it, has not entirely disappeared. It survives in our enduring idea of the garden as a sanctuary, a private paradise, a beautiful retreat from the pressures of the world. It survives in our use of flowers to communicate our deepest emotions, and it survives in our timeless fascination with stories of love, power, and betrayal played out in beautiful, secret places. We are dedicated to exploring these hidden corners of the past, to telling the stories that are often left out of the history books. The story of the noblewoman's garden is a story of women's lives, a narrative of their pleasures, their powers, and their perils. If this journey into the gilded cage has captured your imagination and sparked your curiosity, we invite you to continue exploring with us. By subscribing to our channel, you enable us to continue our work of bringing these forgotten worlds to life. Let us now retreat from the cultivated sunlit worlds we have explored. We must leave behind the manicured paths of the court and the sacred order of the cloister. Our journey now takes us to the margins, to the frayed and shadowed edges of the medieval world. We travel to a place of tangled weeds and ancient secrets, a place that does not appear on any map of the manor, yet was as vital to its existence as the church or the mill. We are seeking the garden of the woman who lived apart, the healer, the midwife, the keeper of secrets, the cunning woman, the witch. Her dwelling is not found within the cozy, clustered heart of the village. It stands alone in that liminal space where the tamed world of human settlement bleeds into the untamed, primordial power of the wilderness. Her cottage is a small, hunched thing of wattle and daub, its thatched roof shaggy with moss, seeming almost to have grown from the earth itself. It is situated at the edge of the woods, or by the banks of a lonely stream, or at the end of a path that most people do not walk after dark. This physical separation is a mirror of her social position. She is of the community, but not entirely in it. She is the outcast, the other, a figure of profound and unsettling ambiguity. She is often an old woman, a widow, left to fend for herself after her husband and children are gone. Her poverty is a visible cloak, her face a roadmap of a hard life. but her power does not come from wealth or status. It comes from something far older, far deeper. It comes from her knowledge, and the source of that knowledge, her library, her laboratory, her temple, is her garden. But to call it a garden is to use a word that is both right and wrong. It is not the enclosed, ordered, and clearly defined rectangle of the peasant or the nun. Her garden has no walls, no fences. It is a known landscape. It begins with the few tough, potent herbs she cultivates in the shadow of her own cottage wall. But it extends outwards, following the hedgerows, tracing the banks of the river, and reaching deep into the dappled, dangerous twilight of the forest. Her garden is a territory of wisdom, an intricate mental map of the entire local ecosystem. She does not own this land, but she understands it with an intimacy that no one else possesses. She knows the secret places where the most powerful plants grow. She knows the language of the soil, the whispers of the leaves, the ancient rhythms of the sun and the moon. Hers is a garden of weeds, a garden of secrets, and a garden of shadows. The knowledge held by the wise woman was a thing apart from the formal learning of her age. It was not the scholastic, text-based knowledge of the male physicians in the universities, nor the theological Latinate knowledge of the priests. Hers was an oral tradition, a living stream of wisdom passed from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice, stretching back into the mists of a pre-Christian past. It was a knowledge system that was holistic, intuitive, and deeply integrated with the spiritual life of the natural world. To the priest, a plant was simply a part of God's passive creation. To the wise woman, a plant was a living being, possessed of its own spirit, its own power, and its own personality. Her knowledge was not just about identifying a plant and knowing its physical properties. It was about knowing how to enter into a relationship with it. This relationship was governed by a complex and ancient set of rituals. She knew that certain plants could only be harvested at a specific time of day, when their potency was at its peak. She knew that others must be gathered under a particular phase of the moon, their power waxing and waning with the celestial light. She might whisper a charm or an incantation as she pulled a root from the earth, a sign of respect, an apology to the plant spirit for taking its life. She might leave a small offering in its place, a drop of her own saliva, a piece of bread, or a simple, unspoken acknowledgement of the great, reciprocal web of life and death. This worldview was a direct threat to the established order. It was a form of learning that excluded men. It was a spirituality that honored the immanent life force within nature, a belief that stood in stark contrast to the transcendent, sky-dwelling God of the Church, and its efficacy was undeniable. When the priest's prayers failed to break a child's fever, when the university-trained physicians' bleeding and purging only made the patient weaker, it was to the wise woman that the desperate villagers would turn, usually in secret, under the cloak of night. Her role in the community was therefore one of profound paradox. She was a figure of fear and of need. In the daylight, she might be shunned, her solitary nature and strange knowledge making her an object of suspicion. Children might be warned away from her cottage, but in the darkness, in times of sickness, of crisis, of childbirth, she became the most important person in the village. She was the unofficial doctor, the veterinarian, the midwife, and the counselor. She was the keeper of the community's physical and spiritual well-being, the silent, unacknowledged pillar that supported the fragile lives of her neighbors. Her garden, that wild and tangled landscape of knowledge, was the source of it all. Let us walk through this wild garden and look at the common, often overlooked plants that the wise woman transformed into potent medicines. These were not exotic imports. They were the humble, tenacious weeds of the field and forest. The plants that the lord of the manor would consider useless, but which she knew held the power to soothe, to mend, and to save. At the heart of her practice was a deep understanding of what she called women's herbs. Of these, none was more important than mugwort Artemisia vulgaris. This tall, silvery-leafed plant, which grew in an unruly fashion along pathways and in waste places, was considered the ultimate ally of the female body. Its name is tied to Artemis, the Greek goddess of the moon and of women. The wise woman would use a tea or an infusion of mugwort to regulate a woman's menstrual cycle, to ease the intense pain of monthly cramps, and, most importantly, to aid in the perilous process of childbirth. A warm decoction of mugwort was believed to ease labor pains and to help expel the afterbirth, a critical and often dangerous stage of delivery. It was a plant of profound comfort, a helper that saw women through the most difficult and painful passages of their lives. For the constant injuries of a life of hard labor, the cuts, the scrapes, the bruises, she would turn to Yarrow Achillea millefolium. This feathery-leaved herb, with its flat-topped clusters of white or pinkish flowers, grew everywhere. It was so common as to be almost invisible. But the wise woman knew it as woundwort. She would gather the fresh leaves, crush them between her hands, or chew them into a rough poultice, and apply it directly to a bleeding wound. The plant's powerful, astringent, and antiseptic properties would quickly staunch the flow of blood, clean the wound, and promote rapid healing. It was the village's first aid kit, a simple, effective, and freely available remedy for the everyday violence of medieval life. For the mending of deeper injuries, she relied on comfrey, symphytum, officenal. She knew this large, coarse-leafed plant as knitbone. She would harvest its thick black root, a difficult and earthy task, and pound it into a sticky, mucilaginous pulp. This poultice, when applied to a sprain, a deep bruise, or even a suspected fracture, was believed to have an almost magical ability to soothe inflammation and to encourage the tissues to heal and knit back together. It was a slow, gentle, and powerful medicine, a testament to the earth's deep, restorative power. The wise woman was also a healer of the mind. She understood the deep melancholy, the accidia, that could settle upon a soul in the dark, monotonous months of winter. For this, she might gather St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, a plant with cheerful, sun-like yellow flowers that, when crushed, release a reddish, blood-like oil. She would infuse these flowers in oil, leaving the jar in the sun until the oil turned a deep, ruby red. This infused oil was used externally to heal wounds and burns, but a tea made from the flowers was also known to lift the spirits, to bring a little bit of the summer sun into the darkness of a troubled mind. Her garden was a place of common, gentle grace. The remedies it provided were for the everyday sufferings of her community. Her work was a constant act of compassion, a quiet rebellion against the pain and fragility of the human condition. She was a healer, a nurturer, a force for life, in a world that was so often defined by death. But this healing path, this garden of light, had a shadow, and it was in that shadow that her greatest power and her greatest danger resided. The wise woman's most secret, most dangerous, and most vital knowledge was that which pertained to the deepest mysteries of the female body. She was the village midwife, and her expertise extended far beyond simply catching the baby. She understood the entire cycle of fertility. She knew how to aid conception, and, most perilously, she knew how to prevent it. In an age where the Church preached that the sole purpose of sexual union was procreation, and where the lord of the manor depended on a constantly expanding population of laborers, this knowledge was not just a medical secret. It was a form of political and theological treason. A peasant woman's life was a cycle of near-constant pregnancy and childbirth. To have many children was a blessing from God, the priests would say. But for the woman herself, another pregnancy could be a death sentence. Childbirth was a terrifying and life-threatening ordeal, and each pregnancy brought with it the risk of a fatal hemorrhage, an infection, or an agonizing obstructed labor. Even if she survived, another mouth to feed could push an already struggling family over the edge into outright starvation. For these women, trapped between the demands of their husbands, the doctrines of the Church, and the brutal reality of their own poverty, the ability to control their own fertility was the most desperate and sought after of freedoms, and the wise woman was the only one who held the key. Her forbidden garden contained the abortifacient herbs. The coded, whispered language of the village would refer to them as plants that could bring on a woman's courses or remove a blockage. This was the discreet terminology for knowledge that was punishable by death. One of the most common of these herbs was pennyroyal mentha pulgium, a low-growing member of the mint family with a powerful, pungent scent. A strong, carefully prepared tea of pennyroyal was known to be a potent uterine stimulant, capable of inducing a miscarriage in the early stages of a pregnancy. Another was tansy tenesitum vulgar, a tall button-flowered plant whose bitter, toxic properties were used to expel intestinal worms, but which, in the right dose, could also expel a fetus. The use of these plants was a transaction of profound secrecy and trust. A terrified young woman, unmarried and facing social ruin, or a weary mother of 6, facing another pregnancy she knew she could not survive, would come to the wise woman's cottage at night. There, in the flickering firelight, the secret would be shared. and the bitter tea prepared and administered. This was not a casual act. It was a desperate life-or-death decision. The herbs themselves were dangerous. An incorrect dosage could cause violent illness or even the death of the mother. The wise woman was a practitioner of a high-stakes underground medicine. Her knowledge the only thing that stood between another woman and a future of shame, of starvation, or of death. This secret, radical knowledge was the ultimate form of female autonomy in a world that allowed women almost none. It was a direct challenge to the foundations of patriarchal power. By providing a means to separate sex from procreation, the wise woman usurped the authority of God, as interpreted by the male priesthood. By providing a means to limit family size, she threatened the economic interests of the lord of the manor, who saw his peasants as a renewable resource. The small, weedy, and unassuming plants in her shadow garden were, in their own quiet way, the most revolutionary things in the entire medieval world. And it was this power, this secret knowledge held by women, for women, that would eventually be reframed as the most diabolical of all sins. The transition was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping chilling of the intellectual and spiritual climate. The late Middle Ages saw the rise of the great universities, which formalized the study of medicine and systematically excluded women from their ranks. The knowledge of the university-trained male physician, based on classical texts, was elevated as the only legitimate form of medicine. The traditional, empirical, female-held knowledge of the wise woman was recast as ignorant superstition, the foolish babbling of old wives. At the same time, a new and virulent strain of theological paranoia began to take hold within the church. Theologians and inquisitors became obsessed with the devil, with demons, and with the supposed earthly agents of this infernal kingdom, witches. This obsession culminated in the publication, in the late 15th century, of one of the most monstrous and influential books ever written, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This book was a detailed, pseudo-scholarly, and deeply misogynistic manual for the identification, prosecution, and extermination of witches, and at the very heart of its paranoid worldview was the figure of the midwife, the wise woman. The Malleus accused these women of being the devil's chief agents on earth. It claimed, with a lurid and obsessive detail, that they would cause men to become impotent, that they would steal male organs, and, most terribly, that their primary service to Satan was to kill unbaptized infants, often by magical means during childbirth, and to offer these innocent souls to their dark master. With this, the tragic inversion was complete. The wise woman's garden, once a source of healing and life, was now reframed as a diabolical laboratory. The entire web of her ancient knowledge was systematically demonized. The comfrey she used to mend a broken bone was now the key ingredient in a cursed ointment that allowed her to fly to the Sabbat. The mugwort she used to ease the pains of childbirth was now the tool she used to cause a miscarriage in a healthy woman or to cast a blight upon a neighbor's livestock. Her calming teas were now love potions, designed to ensnare and corrupt innocent men. And most damningly of all, her secret, forbidden knowledge of contraception and abortion, was twisted into the ultimate proof of her satanic allegiance. Her ability to bring on a woman's courses was seen not as an act of desperate compassion, but as the murder of an unbaptized soul, the most heinous crime imaginable in the medieval Christian worldview. Her garden of secrets became a garden of sin. The healing path and the shadow path were merged into a single, damnable road to hell. The age of the great witch hunts had begun. The woman who had once been a pillar of her community, albeit a feared and marginalized one, now became its scapegoat. In times of trouble, a failed harvest, a plague, a sudden death, the fearful eyes of the village would turn towards her cottage on the edge of the woods. She would be dragged from her home, her body searched for the devil's mark, her garden would be searched for evidence. Her knowledge, once whispered in gratitude, would now be screamed against her as an accusation in a courtroom. Under brutal torture, she would confess to impossible crimes, to flying, to copulating with the devil, and to cursing her neighbors. And she would be burned at the stake, her life, her knowledge, and her wisdom consumed in the purifying flames of a world that had come to fear the very power that had sustained it for so long. Her garden of weeds was her undoing, its tangled, living secrets the final silent testament to her innocence and to the terrible, tragic madness of her age. The story of the wise woman and her garden is a difficult and somber one. It is a story of immense knowledge and of profound loss. It is a tale of how wisdom can be twisted into witchcraft, and how healing can be demonized as harm. These are the kinds of hidden histories we are committed to telling, the narratives of the voiceless, the marginalized, and the forgotten. These stories are essential to understanding the full, complex, and often dark tapestry of our shared past. If you believe that these stories matter, if you wish to continue exploring the shadowed corners of history with us, we humbly ask you to subscribe to our channel. Your support is the vital ingredient that allows us to continue this work, to keep these fragile flames of memory alive. Our long and winding journey through the forgotten gardens of medieval women now approaches its end. We have walked the muddy, pragmatic furrows of the peasant's patch, a world of raw, unrelenting survival. We have paced the serene, cruciform pathways of the monastic cloister, a world of sacred order and shadowed secrets. We have lingered in the perfumed, treacherous air of the noblewoman's bower, a world of aesthetic pleasure and deadly political games. And we have stood at the wild, untamed edge of the wise woman's territory, a world of ancient knowledge and profound, mortal danger. Each of these gardens was a unique and distinct world, a reflection of the vastly different lives of the women who tended them. Yet, as we now draw back and look upon this historical landscape from a greater distance, a single, powerful, and unifying pattern emerges, a common thread, woven in soil and stone, in flowers and in thorns, binds all these disparate worlds together. It is the simple, yet profound, reality of the enclosure. The peasant's garden was enclosed by a humble wattle fence, the nun's by a high, impenetrable stone wall, the noblewoman's by a manicured hedge or an ornate brick barrier. Even the wise woman's garden, though seemingly boundless, was a conceptual enclosure, a secret territory of knowledge whose boundaries were invisible to the uninitiated. This recurring image of the enclosure, of the walled space, is the ultimate key to understanding not only the gardens, but also the very nature of female existence in the medieval world. The garden was a microcosm, a living, breathing metaphor for the medieval woman's own life. Her existence, from the moment of her birth to the moment of her death, was circumscribed, contained, and defined by a series of powerful and often unyielding walls. These were not always walls of stone and mortar. They were the invisible, but no less solid, walls of social class, of religious doctrine, of legal status, and of patriarchal expectation. Her life was, in its very essence, a walled garden, and the story of these forgotten gardens is ultimately the story of how women learned not just to survive within these walls, but to cultivate a world of their own, a world of meaning, of purpose, of knowledge, and of a quiet, persistent, and deeply rooted power. Let us first examine the walls themselves, the great architecture of containment that defined a woman's life. The first and most fundamental wall was that of her social class, the station into which she was born. For the peasant woman, this wall was built of earth and obligation. She was born a serf, bound to the land of her lord, her life a cycle of labor dictated by the agricultural calendar and the demands of the manor. She could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. She could not marry without his consent and the payment of a fine. Her world was physically contained, its boundaries marked by the fields and forests of the estate. Her garden was a small, sanctioned enclosure within this much larger system of containment. For the noblewoman, the walls were gilded, but they were no less real. Her world was contained within the stone fortifications of the castle. Her life was a carefully managed performance within the claustrophobic, intensely scrutinized world of the court. Her marriage was not a matter of personal choice, but a strategic move in the great game of dynastic politics. Her body and her fertility a commodity to be traded for land and alliances. The beautiful, perfumed garden where she took her leisure was a gilded cage, a space of apparent freedom that was, in reality, a carefully controlled and constantly monitored environment. For the nun, the wall was absolute and explicit. Her vow of enclosure was a spiritual and physical reality. The moment she passed through the convent gate for the last time, the world was, in theory, dead to her. The wall was a deliberate and permanent severing of her ties to her family, to her past, and to the entire secular world. Her life was to be lived entirely within the contained, ordered, and sacred space of the monastery. Her garden was an enclosed paradise within an enclosed spiritual fortress. And for the wise woman, the wall was one of social ostracization. She was contained by the fear and suspicion of her neighbors. She lived on the margins, in a space defined by the invisible but powerful line that separated the acceptable from the strange and the orthodox from the heretical. Her wild garden was a territory of otherness, a place that existed outside the neat, ordered boundaries of the village community. Within this universal context of enclosure, the garden became a space of profound psychological and social significance. It was, in many ways, the only space where a woman could exercise a degree of genuine agency and control. In a world where her body, her marriage, her labor, and her very soul were often subject to the authority of men of fathers, husbands, lords, and priests, the garden was her domain. It was a small piece of the world that she could shape according to her own knowledge, her own skill, and her own will. Here, in the act of turning the soil, of planting a seed, of tending a growing thing, a woman was not a passive object, but an active creator. The peasant woman, in deciding where to plant her beans and how to protect her cabbages, was making a series of autonomous life or death decisions. The sister infermeress, in her meticulous cultivation of medicinal herbs, was engaging in a sophisticated scientific practice, a pursuit of knowledge that gave her a unique and respected form of authority. The noblewoman, in the design and management of her pleasure garden, was expressing her own aesthetic tastes and creating the stage upon which she could conduct her complex social maneuvers. And the wise woman, in her intimate, reciprocal relationship with the wild plants of her territory, was practicing a form of power that was entirely her own, a power that was so potent and so threatening that the world eventually sought to destroy her for it. The garden was a reflection of a woman's inner life, a physical manifestation of her knowledge, her resilience, and her creativity. It was a space where she could impose her own order on a small corner of a chaotic world that was constantly seeking to impose its order upon her. The act of cultivating a garden was an act of quiet, persistent, and deeply rooted self-assertion. It was a way of saying, "This space is mine. This knowledge is mine. This life, which I nurture from the earth, is a product of my own hands and my own mind." The physical gardens of the medieval world have long since vanished, plowed under by the relentless march of time, of progress, and of changing landscapes. The specific social and theological walls that contained the lives of medieval women have crumbled. Yet, the metaphorical power of the walled garden and the legacy of the women who cultivated their lives within it endure. The echoes of these forgotten gardens are all around us, embedded in our culture, our language, our science, and our deepest psychological archetypes. The most direct and tangible echo is found in our ongoing, and often troubled, relationship with herbal medicine. The knowledge that was cultivated in the infirmary garden of the nun and the wild garden of the wise woman was for centuries dismissed as mere folk medicine, the superstitious nonsense of uneducated women. The rise of a male-dominated, university-trained medical profession systematically devalued and suppressed this ancient female-held tradition. But in our own time, we are witnessing a remarkable and powerful resurgence of interest in this lost knowledge. Modern science, with its sophisticated tools of chemical analysis, is now isolating, studying, and validating the very active compounds that these medieval women knew only through intuition, tradition, and direct, empirical observation. When we use a willow bark extract aspirin for a headache, when we use a foxglove derivative digitalis to treat a heart condition, and when we use St. John's wort to lift our spirits, we are, in a very real sense, harvesting the fruits of their ancient gardens. The modern pharmaceutical industry, for all its technological prowess, is deeply indebted to the pioneering ethnobotanical work of these countless, nameless women. The wise woman's weed, once condemned as a tool of the devil, is now the subject of peer-reviewed scientific papers. The wheel has, in some small way, come full circle. The legacy of the noblewoman's garden echoes in our enduring conception of the garden as a place of beauty, of sanctuary, and of personal expression. The modern domestic garden, with its emphasis on ornamental flowers, its carefully designed layout, and its role as a space for leisure and socializing, is a direct descendant of the aristocratic pleasance. The very idea of the garden as a private retreat, a beautiful, enclosed space where we can escape from the pressures of the public world, is a powerful cultural inheritance from the medieval court. When we give a bouquet of red roses to a lover, we are participating in a romantic language that was first codified in the courtly love gardens of the High Middle Ages. The garden, as a landscape of the heart, a theater of our emotions, is a concept that was born in the shadow of the castle wall. The echo of the peasant woman's garden is perhaps the most subtle and yet the most vital. It endures in the quiet, persistent wisdom of the allotment gardener, in the thrifty, sustainable practices of the homesteader, and in the growing global movement towards food security and local, organic agriculture. In an age of industrial farming and global supply chains, the act of cultivating a small patch of earth to feed one's family has become, once again, a radical act. The modern gardener who saves their own seeds, who makes their own compost, who tends their small plot with a deep and intimate knowledge of its unique conditions, is walking a path that the medieval peasant woman would have instantly recognized. The peasant's garden was a model of a closed-loop, sustainable, and intensely local food system. The rediscovery of these principles in our own time is not a step backwards. It is a vital step towards a more resilient and more sustainable future. The muddy, pragmatic wisdom of the pottage plot is an echo that we would do well to heed. But the most profound and enduring legacy of these gardens is the metaphor of the walled soul itself. The image of the enclosed garden as a representation of the inner life of a private, protected, and cultivated internal world remains one of the most powerful archetypes in our culture. We still speak of our inner landscape. We still understand the need to tend to the garden of our own mind. The idea that the soul is a space that requires cultivation, that it can be a place of beauty and order or a place of neglect and chaos, is a concept that the medieval woman would have understood in her very bones. For the medieval nun, the goal was to cultivate a garden of pure, spiritual virtues, to uproot the weeds of sin and temptation, and to create a pristine, internal paradise for God. For us, in our secular age, the goal may be different, but the metaphor still holds. We strive to cultivate a garden of mental and emotional well-being. We seek to uproot the weeds of anxiety, of fear, and of anger. We try to nurture the flowers of compassion, of creativity, and of peace. The language has changed, but the fundamental human project of cultivating the inner world remains the same. The stories of these medieval women and their gardens are a powerful and timeless lesson in this art of inner cultivation. They teach us that even when we find ourselves in circumstances of profound constraint, even when our lives are defined by walls, both literal and metaphorical, it is always possible to cultivate a space of our own. It is always possible to find a small patch of earth, a small corner of our own consciousness, and to make it a place of life, of knowledge, and of beauty. These women were not passive victims of their circumstances. They were active, creative, and profoundly resilient agents in their own lives. They took the small, enclosed spaces that their world allotted them, and they transformed them. They turned a muddy patch of dirt into a lifeline. They turned an enclosure of stone into a laboratory of healing. They turned a gilded cage into a theater of power. And they turned a territory of exile into a repository of a deep and ancient wisdom. Their gardens were a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to create, to nurture, and to find meaning, even in the most constrained of worlds. The story of the forgotten gardens of medieval women is, in the end, a story about us. It is a story about our own walled souls, about the enclosures that limit our lives, and about our own innate capacity to cultivate a world of meaning within them. It is a story of a quiet, green, and deeply rooted power that resides not in the grand gestures of history, but in the small, patient, and life-giving act of tending to a garden. We are passionate about unearthing these hidden histories, about giving voice to the voiceless, and about exploring the deep, resonant stories that connect our past to our present. The narratives of women, the history of the natural world, the secret lives of ordinary people, these are the gardens we seek to tend. If this journey has moved you, if it has sparked your curiosity or offered you a moment of quiet reflection, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. You are not just clicking a button, you are helping to cultivate this space. You are providing the vital nourishment that allows us to continue our work, to dig deeper, and to share the forgotten stories that so desperately need to be told. Join us. There are so many more walls to look over, and so many more secret gardens to explore. For now, let the memory of these women, and the quiet, resilient strength of their walled souls, bring you a deep and lasting peace.